in our broad strategic plan for kids, which you see a visual of that on slide 2. The purpose of schools is to ensure that children are educated, that every child that graduates from Texas public schools can achieve some success in what comes next. And so you see that set of guiding strategic priorities where we try to synthesize all of your legislative structures and mandates to try to simplify that for schools when they execute the work. I will say, though, that there is nothing more complex than educating the next generation of Americans. On page 3, you have a very high-level analysis showing you much of the same numbers that you had in 25 pages from the LBB's presentation. And what this shows you is 3 rows: state funds, then federal funds, and all funds. What this does not include is local property taxes. I'll get to that in a moment, which is another key funding vehicle for public education. But what you can see is that from the 22-23 biennium to the biennium that we are in today, there was roughly a $10 billion increase in state funding for public education. That was in part per pupil increases to school district budgets, and that was in part a shift away from property taxes to state revenues to fund public education. And what you also then see is another $10 billion increase from your introduced budget in Senate Bill 1, which again represents in part an increase in per pupil budgets for districts, as you have proposed in Senate Bill 1, and in part a reduction in property taxes as a means of funds taken up by the state. So for each of the last 4 years projected to the next 4 years, there have been funding increases for public schools that they actually feel in their budgets with respect to funding appropriated by the legislature. That is not all that well understood, but that has in fact happened. And then there's been a steady shift away from relying on property taxes to fund public education and to state revenues to fund public education. Through that same time period, you see federal funds summarized there. 22-23 and 24-25 show the sort of baseline of federal funds, and then a slight increase in federal funds in total. As Senator Kokorsk noted, there is a big funding infusion that is running dry from the feds, which was actually exclusively ESSER 3. ESSER 2 was from something called Carissa, which predated that. So the total of that was $16 billion, not 11. But what you do see is tracking the federal funds authorized into funding categories by the legislature. This is what you see in the budgets. Slide 4, what we attempt to do, because of the ridiculous complexity that exists in public education finance, we try to provide just a summary all-in number for you. And what this data set draws from is actually the certified annual financial reports of school systems. So under the category of the sort of bank balances doesn't lie, this is a picture of the all-in revenue funding for school districts over the last, you can see, roughly 10 years. And we've sliced it in a couple of ways just for simplicity. One, you have state funds authorized in the system. And what you'll notice there is that this thing ends in 22-23. We do not have finished closed books for the 23-24 school year, which would be the first year that you would see the huge infusion of resources associated with tax compression. And so if I would project this bar one more, the blue bar goes way up and the gray bar comes down. So blue is your state funding flows. Gray is property taxes. And you'll notice there's 3 different grays. There's that sort of vertical slice gray. That is INS, which is funded almost exclusively out of property taxes. There actually is some state funding for debt service, but it's pretty small. And then the hash blue and gray is recapture, because that is in fact originally a property tax, but it is recaptured and redirected as state funding to other schools around the state. And then the green bar is federal funds, and that's the net of all federal funds based upon budgeted audited financial statements from districts. And again, to point out there, you saw a pretty big jump in the size of that green bar from the 1920 school year, where there really was no COVID money specific to that. There's a little bit of COVID money in 1920. To 2021, when the first tranche of COVID money begins to show up in school district budgets. Then 21-22, when the major COVID spending began happening inside of district budgets. The year that we are currently sitting in, the 24-25 school year, that green bar is going to be smaller. You won't see that for a couple of years because this is a lagging financial picture, because the one-time federal money has, as Senator Colcourse pointed out, dried up. So this, again, is just an all-in picture of what revenue school districts receive, and there are actually a couple of other totals that we put in here. So funding for like us and the service centers, which is a very small sliver of this particular pie, but that is also in this total. Going to our budget, you see on slide 5, Article 3 and the TEA portion of your bill pattern is a very large portion. In fact, it is the largest portion of your bill pattern. But most of the money that you appropriate for us is in fact pass-through funds. And so this tries to visualize the size of the pass-through. That's the dark blue and the green and the other blue cover. And then the very light blue is the funding specifically for TEA oversight of public education. And you can see TEA's budget is about half general revenue, about a third federal, and then a little bit of teacher certification fees. And the teacher certification fees is actually a reason why you have an exceptional item from us, because we're no longer seeing teachers get certified in Texas. Staying specifically on TEA on slide 6, this is a very small piece of the budget, but y'all are generally interested in how we operate. And you gave us through the Texas Facilities Commission, there was a small amount to sort of rehab our facilities. So prior to COVID, we operated on 9 floors across 2 buildings. We are now operating on 5 floors in 1 building. We've significantly downsized our physical footprint. And also, since COVID, we've started hiring staff from all over the state. This has been a huge advantage for us. So we have field support staff, and then we have regional staff really all over the state now. It's been a significant improvement in our ability to provide customer service to the field, because we have people that are employed closer to schools. Also increases our access to talent from around the state. So that's just an FYI on things going on at the agency. A high-level summary of things that are in Senate Bill 1 of relevance to public education. You got this in very significant detail from LBB, but you are in Senate Bill 1, you are fully funding the Foundation School Program. All expected enrollment growth, all expected growth of weighted students, it is fully funded. And you've also kept funding for all of the non-Foundation School Program items. So think about funding specifically for students to attend math academies. That's provided by the state, or not students, teachers. That's provided on a very small scale by the legislature. That has been continued as previous. So that's what you see summarized on slide 8. On slide 9, there are then more money for public education. So about $1 billion. About $4 billion for teacher compensation. That's general teacher compensation. Another $750 million for a expansion of the teacher incentive allotment. That is, just so you know, that is not an expansion of the teacher incentive allotment under current law. That actually assumes that you have about a $750 million expansion of the teacher incentive allotment that is expected under current law, and then this doubles that. So it's a substantive expansion, which would require statute. You have education savings accounts, as previously mentioned. You have the school safety allotment that is essentially proposed to double in your introduced budget, which would require either a statute or some specific mechanism in the Appropriations Act, and then additional property tax relief. A few much smaller elements in the bill pattern, but worth talking about. Slide 10. There's a new initiative funded by the legislature called Texas Strategic Leadership, which is really an investment in leadership capacity of school system leaders around the state of Texas. It's also an investment in streamlining grant programs, which would be a boon to rural districts in particular, so they don't have to apply for 25 different grants. We try to do it all at once. So that is really meant to help school system leaders be more effective and more supported around the state. You have the Santa Fe 10 Memorial that is in there, and then an expansion of funding for a food security grant for preschool-age children in there. We have a few exceptional items that are worth highlighting. You heard the LBB lay them out. I will, at the risk of being redundant, lay them out again. So on page 12 is the first one. This is an exceptional item request. This is funding specific to the Texas Education Agency. We will see a reduction of ballpark $4 million a year because teachers are no longer getting certified. A portion of our budget is funded by teacher certification fees. That budget pays for our educator misconduct investigators. So I will have to lay them all off unless we can find another funding source to support that. But in addition to that, we've asked for a slight increase because of the increased number of complaints, misconduct allegations, and others that we're experiencing. So on slide 13, there is a placeholder item, $1. I would love it if you appropriated slightly more than $1 for this item. And this is to support implementation of high-quality curriculum, specifically the Open Education Resource or Bluebonnet instructional materials. So the budget automatically pays for the purchase of those materials. This is to pay for the training of teachers, principals, and others in districts that use those materials. Slide 14 has a placeholder item for infusions of special education, which would potentially be a bill that consistent with the SPED Finance Commission's recommendations. This, I think, spoke to Senator Perry's question about there's a differential in cost related to some students in special education. And right now, funding formulas do differentiate by the cost of students, but they do that poorly. So sometimes you might receive an extra $10,000 for a student that might cost you an extra $50,000. So that's something that the SPED Finance Commission recommended that we would recommend both the statute and increase appropriations to support that. Slide 15 covers two things related to supporting our teachers. One is to make sure that teachers, when they are hired, are prepared to teach. There's been a significant increase, as mentioned, in uncertified teachers. And so trying to invest in preparation before folks are thrown in the classroom is generally a really good thing. Also paying our teachers in ways generally that are more than they're getting now, but also specifically that are strategic, so that as they improve in their efficacy, that their compensation matches that. Last but not least, as the pass-through entity for the state for the Windham School District, we have provided their exceptional item request in there, which you did fund in the introduced budget. We have a few other non-exceptional item rider requests that are highlighted on slide 18. The two that I would draw your attention to that are not funded are the ones in blue. The two that were in the introduced bill were in green. And it is essentially asking for authority related to unexpended federal funds. Because of all of the huge infusion of federal resources, there is some leftover money that we are attempting to manage, including generating interest off of those funds. So we're asking for some flexibility into how to manage some of those funds across the biennium, just so that we don't have to send any money back to the feds. And so that's, members, my high-level overview. I'm happy to entertain questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Senator Creighton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, appreciate your presentation and always being available for questions as we work through the session and the goals and strategies. On your strategic plan overview, I'm trying to get an idea with our goals in mind for our students, for every student in the state, right? For not only preparation for success in college, but a career or the military, whatever might be their appropriate path. I know that we've had NAEP scores out recently, and we're continuing to build and to climb. There are categories that are concerning, but we always, in this building, we're trying to figure out the best way to leverage our dollars and also have it directly impact those that we're trying to help the most. So can you give us some insight onto what we saw in those NAEP scores, how Texas performed and where we're headed within this strategic plan and overview, and
Yeah.
and just a high altitude for the committee, and then we can go into a couple of questions on the funding.
It's a great question. In front of you, you have our handy-dandy annual report, which we put out each year that tries to provide a high-level picture of this. The very last page of that includes an insert as well, and this speaks to the NAEP tests that the senator was referring to. So, for the benefit of the broader committee, NAEP it stands for National Assessment of Educational Progress. It is a random sample test given to a subset of students in every state in grades 4 and 8 in reading and math on the same basic questions, which means you can use this test to see how Texas is faring in grades 4 and 8 reading and math relative to the rest of the nation. The insert comes with the data from the most recent NAEP test, which was taken roughly February of 2024. So you should have this one-page document hopefully handy in your annual report handout. And what you'll see there is on a raw or unadjusted basis, in 4th grade reading, we are 37th in the union. In 8th grade reading, we are 44th. In 4th grade math, we are 8th. In 8th grade math, we are 34th. Everything in public education is complex. If you think we have roughly 21% of our students who don't speak English at home. In Oregon, they might have 4 or 6% of their students who don't speak English at home, but we're all given the same English test in 4th grade. So we also look at how we're doing, assuming demographic equivalence, and you can also see that on that. So when you assume that every state has the same student population, we are 9th and 10th in reading and 3rd and 6th in math. So that appears better, but of course life doesn't grade on the curve. Our objective is to have our students be the highest performing students in the country, period. So we have seen some backsliding in the most recent 2 years in NAEP, is the short answer to your question. And while we have done historically well on an apples-to-apples basis, we have not done historically well on a raw basis, given our overall outcomes. And I think there's a variety of reasons for why we have seen backsliding in Texas in the last 2 years. I think not least among them is we had no public accountability system for public education in the last 2 years, and we have reason to know that public school accountability improves student outcomes, so when you turn it off for 2 years, it's logical to conclude that we'd see a reduction in student outcomes. I think there are other reasons, for example, the growth in uncertified teachers. Our districts are interested in hiring the most skilled talent possible, but people have to be trained. And the most recent school year that we are sitting in, the majority of first-year hired teachers were in fact uncertified. It's the first time that's ever happened in state history. So I think there's a variety of reasons for it. With regard to sort of budget issues in school districts have faced inflationary pressure, just like the rest of us have faced inflationary pressure. And school districts have seen funding infusions. We have raw dollars and inflation-adjusted dollars that we publish in a variety of reports. But the way money is spent also matters in terms of total money spent. So you can imagine if you do a funding infusion that is undirected, this has generally been spent, and about $1,000 per pupil increase in student spending has been shown to net about 4 days of additional learning time when undirected. And so making up for a COVID decline, you would need to have increased total spending by something like $45,000 with that kind of ROI motto, which would, I think, end all state economic activity if that happened. And so we are also aware that there are other investments that can be made in public education that have a substantially higher ROI than $1,000 for 4 days. And so, again, we're appreciative of the huge infusion of resources that's already been identified by the introduced bill. But when we think about the need to drive outcomes up for students, there is a need to also deal with some sort of inflationary cost pressure in districts. So some mix of funding that has a high ROI for kids and then funding that is flexible to deal with inflation, I think is probably quite appropriate for the legislature to consider.
So we have LBB, reported we have between 8.2 and 8.5 billion in new funding for our public schools. We have a 93 to a $96 billion total expenditure based on the numbers I'm hearing today. There is a difference between when you take $96 billion and you spread it across 5.3 million public school students. My math is that for the biennium, that's north of 18,000 for the biennium, but when you divide that in half for 1 year, that's north of 9,000. But you publish a $15,000 number, and so does the LBB. I guess I'll switch over to the LBB on this question, but reconcile the delta between the math of dividing this incredible lift of $96 billion, including almost $8.5 billion of new dollars. Normally, we don't put more than $2 billion of new dollars into public education, but that comes out per year just north of 9,000. How do we get to the 15,000 per student?
Yes, sir. So the primary difference between, I think the figures you're referencing and the more like a 15,000 per student is going to be that local revenue component of the foundation school program. So
And
those
so
are local
that
property
delta
taxes.
of $4 or $5 grand
Yes.
is the difference.
Yes, and those are not, those local retained collections are not appropriated by the state, and so they wouldn't be in the appropriations bill numbers,
Yeah.
but they are incorporated into our estimates for the program.
I think that's important, members and commissioner, as we're talking about visiting with our folks at home, right? Our school leaders and our teachers and those advocates for public school, like we all are. I mean, we love our public schools, and we have an incredible assortment of public schools and teachers and leaders across the state that are dedicated every single day to increasing student outcomes. But the math is complex, so I wanted to make sure that when we see these printed reports, we know what we're talking about here. Thank you for that clarification. So understanding that to be the case, and we don't want to talk about, I'd like to feature some of the success in Houston ISD. Just as an example, there are many, many things that still need to change in Houston ISD, right? But with 2,000 less administrators and the funding provided last session, from our numbers, 121 D and F rated schools are now at 39. Less than 40 D and F rated schools. How did that? What's happening there? How did that turn around that fast?
Yeah, that is a great question. It is certainly worthy of a lot more positive publicity than it is getting. And if I could add one relevant fact to the accolades for what has happened in 1 year there. So we do not, of course, have actual A through F ratings. We've been enjoined by the courts from doing that for 2 years. But we track the underlying raw data. So the underlying raw data would indicate that statewide there were a little over 600 campuses. In fact, I think we have this in your annual report, that there were roughly 626 campuses that would have performed in the F performance band for school year ending 23. Of those 626, in the next year, 3 of them would have performed in the A performance band. All 3 of those happen to be Houston ISD campuses. It's been a pretty remarkable improvement in learning outcomes for students year over year. It's probably the largest academic gain that's ever been seen at that scale in U.S. history, to be perfectly frank. So the what has caused it is a whole set of operational changes inside of Houston ISD. As you mentioned, there's been a substantive redirection of resources to the classroom, substantive pay increases for teachers. But these are curriculum changes, these are instructional leadership changes, these are master schedule changes, these are changes to improve discipline. There's a whole host of changes that are happening there.
So I want to stop you right there, but that list you just named, curriculum, a revision on our current policies related to discipline and keeping a classroom orderly so that teachers can actually perform, right, based on their craft. And that's what a lot of frustration for our teachers among nearly 400,000 surveys across the state that are random based on when districts are applying them, but that's the number one issue that they mention. Safety is first, and then validation from administrators and keeping their classroom order is next, and those two may tie together, right? And then compensation is, of course, at the top of the list as well. It's 3 and sometimes 4 on the ranking for those surveys on average.
Yeah.
But how do we continue to bolster public school funding like we're doing with as I mentioned, we normally have a trend of $2 billion a biennium that we're investing in new money into public schools. Now we're at north of 8. How do we bring those types of outcomes that we're seeing in Houston ISD to all the kids that deserve a lift and support? I mean, we're not competing against local school districts in the legislature, we're partnering with them in all these different avenues for opportunities. We are very well intentioned on those efforts along with historic funding, right? But how do we best spend our dollars? Is it the basic allotment, or is it making sure that it's an increase in the basic allotment? If you could remind us, how does that affect the other allotments when we increase the basic allotment, and then these other strategies that are working at Houston ISD?
Yes, sir. So a $1 increase in the basic allotment generates generally about $7.5 million of additional funding for public schools around the state. And if you sort of think about the math on that for just a second, it actually doesn't make sense initially, because there are roughly 5.5 million kids in public schools. So how does 1 times 5.5 million become 7.5 million? And it's because when you increase the basic allotment, you're not just increasing the basic allotment, you're increasing all the things that are keyed off of the basic allotment, which includes the Tier 2 copper penny yield, among other things. It includes the early education allotment, the bilingual allotment, SPED, CTE, et cetera. So as you increase the basic allotment, what that does is it provides both a combination of funds targeted for certain strategies and funds that are quite flexible for school districts. And so an increase in the basic allotment would help school districts deal with broader inflationary pressures that they've had to deal with locally, however they might allocate it. But that isn't the same thing as investing in other areas that have, say, demonstrated ROI. So you think about curricular investments. An increase in the basic allotment, a school district could spend that on curriculum, but they can spend that on just about anything else they want. So there are other, what I've observed over the last several sessions is the legislature has invested sort of in a mixed strategy, providing additional funding for districts that is quite flexible, and then additional funding for districts that are based around relatively high ROI strategies, like you're seeing in some of those local examples. And so that has always made logical sense to me, and it's certainly something to consider. It is also worth, I'm going to connect these two dots because I don't think this is all that clear. You heard LBB testify to the increase in weighted students. And on page 10 of the LBB's report, it shows really the 4 big categories of what those weights are in terms of students. And so one of them you can see quite clearly an increase in the SPED student population. So this is not actually just about a mix of students, it's actually more special education students relative to the total student population. To frame that a different way, I think when I started as commissioner, roughly 8.6% of Texas students were receiving special education services, and now we're above 14%. So that is a weighted student cost increase. But the other two, it's actually, it might be easy to miss this. Bilingual and CTE increases. The increase in bilingual ADA is not solely because we have more students coming to our schools that do not speak English. It is because that y'all have embedded certain financial incentives inside the bilingual program funding. And again, I just don't think this is all that well understood. If you have a classroom that you organize at an elementary school where you have half of the kids come from households that don't speak English and half of the kids come from households that do speak English, and you decide you are going to teach the children both the English language and the Spanish language, so they become dually literate. Clearly, for the students who don't speak English at home, they need to become proficient in the English language. But for the other students, they get the benefit of becoming and developing proficiency in the Spanish language. The way that your funding formulas work, those non-English speaking students in a two-way dual language classroom count and draw down additional bilingual ADA. So some of your increase in bilingual ADA is not because there's some demographic shift that's happening. It's because school districts are responding to a funding incentive to encourage dual literacy that the legislature has established. Same thing with CTE. You have created funding incentives to provide districts with more money as kids get into more and more advanced classes. I can take welding 1 as a freshman, but if I take that welding practicum as a senior, I get even more money in the funding formulas. So some of this increase in CTE FTEs is because districts are reorienting their CTE offerings to get more aggressive at having these advanced CTE courses. So this is an example of, I think, you can increase the basic allotment and it provides flexible funding, but you can also increase funding in targeted ways that have fairly high ROI, and the districts do respond to those funding incentives.
Well, let's talk about those funding strategies, those buckets. So in the Senate, we've had a trend in recent years not to increase the basic allotment as much as the House has, but then we've provided significant funding for different funding streams and targeted priorities. So in other words, just our teacher pay efforts last session and our safety investments, that was the equivalent for school districts of $15,000 and under of a $350 basic allotment increase. That is a significant basic allotment increase, right? And that's what we passed out of the Senate.
Yes,
but
that's
this
right.
time around, we have enrollment growth, we have a golden penny yield, we have teacher pay raises across the board, school safety, and then a replenishing of TIA. My question is, and for the benefit of the committee, if those are our strategies, what buckets are we leaving behind?
I think you have not increased in the, if I read that Senate language correctly in SB 1, you do not have a specific allocation for the basic allotment in there.
Correct. Last time around, we considered in the $60 range, but it was just the allotments that we were funding.
That's right. Yeah, and so you have dedicated funding for what could be a teacher compensation allotment. You have a doubling of funding for the teacher incentive allotment. You have a doubling of funding for the school safety allotment. So those are all extremely important investments. And then you have an increase in funding that happens automatically in Tier 2 in the golden penny yield, which is completely flexible money for school districts. And I think that's about $300 million in the first year and about $500 million in the second year of the biennium, so about $800 million total. But you don't have a specific allocation for the basic allotment and then, of course, any of the cascading things that drive off the basic allotment.
So to boil it down, with $8.5 billion of new money for public ed and $96 billion total, with what we're seeing in the NAEP scores and the significant progress that we have to make quickly for our future workforce and most importantly for these kids, these students, how do we make sure that we're spending the money in the categories or buckets that will bring the best results? Alabama was the greatest jump, the state of Alabama, on improving on the NAEP scores. They jumped from the bottom of the list to 33. And they cite rigor and new curriculum, teaching methods, and accountability as the 3 reasons why they made that kind of jump. That is our plan, right? I mean, we're consistent last session and this session with the trends, what Houston is applying now, and it's incredibly successful there. What are we leaving out?
What I will say is in Alabama these are state employees. They have invested heavily in instructional coaching. Now Alabama is maybe the size of 2 school districts in Harris County. So just as a frame of reference, we probably need to structure that a little different than these be state employees. Yeah. But they have invested pretty heavily in instructional coaching to support improvements in instructional efficacy in classroom instructional delivery.
Which is what we have going on in Houston ISD now, correct?
Yeah, their approach to instructional coaching is through their leadership system. So a very strong set of systems for instructional coaching. That's correct.
So just quickly tell the committee and remind us Tier 2 categories. And again, I'm still on this subject of what bucket are we leaving behind? Property and casualty insurance, utilities. I'm just bringing up random costs. How are we doing on our goals if we're specific to strategies and funding initiatives and not completely reliant on raising the basic allotment as the only strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've made substantive investments in 4 pretty important operational strategies for school systems. The idea of inflationary pressure that school districts face outside of the teaching core, because the biggest expense is going to typically be on, the biggest expense is always personnel, and the biggest personnel expense is teaching. But outside of that inflationary pressure that districts face, they would either need to manage solely with the Tier 2 golden penny yield that they will get increase, or you would need to entertain some flexible infusion of resources akin to the basic allotment.
Senator Creighton, and so if I could just interject as you're going through that list, I think it's important to note the $450 million that we put in so that the teachers in active care, that their premiums cannot be raised above 10% because they were getting ready to see a significant increase in their health insurance costs. I call that a direct state, assistance to public education where we're helping our teachers keep their health insurance. Now, I do understand not all the school districts are in active care, but most are. So, I hear when I say that, people say, yeah, but not everybody's in active care. But that's of their choice, and those decisions were made long ago. But
when it's also worth noting, Madam Chair, that y'all have almost a $3 billion direct investment in public schools that does not show up in our bill pattern at all. No one ever counts this as public education spending, and that is the payroll tax that school districts pay for their teachers to participate in the retirement system is entirely paid directly to TRS on their behalf. So if any of you are business owners, you're familiar with paying payroll taxes. School districts don't do that. They do it. They just a huge chunk of that is subsidized off books directly by the state, and people never count that as public ed spending.
Right. So
we do because it shows up in their audited financial statements. It's part of that 15,000, but that's
Dr.
it's about
Bond
$3
and I are
billion
working
per year. So
on a way to change the way that's paid so that the state gets the credit they deserve for paying that $3 billion for that payroll tax.
well, there are also some asymmetries in the way that subsidy works. So weirdly, you
Complicated.
subsidize entirely the cost of their payroll tax for their CFO, but you only subsidize half the cost of their payroll tax for their teachers. So that's also potentially where the policymaking interest.
Right. We're trying to craft something, but it's difficult, let's put it that way. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to point that out because I didn't want that to be forgotten, but you've got all the time you need.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That was very important to highlight, and I know with TRS coming up soon, we're going to talk some more about those impacts, but that was significant. And I think through your leadership, we've continued to bolster and protect TRS, and we always will. Yeah. So, Commissioner, I wanted to ask on special education funding formulas, to say the least, they're very complicated. And as we consider Senator Betancourt's Senate Bill 568 to transition to an intensity of services model, if you could remind us, how does it work in the basic allotment for how students either receive a portion of that basic allotment if they have special education requirements, and what's the trigger?
Yeah, this is a great question with unbridled complexity. This is where you're in master's degree land in school finance now. So
but it's very important because we're seeing an incredible rise, right, in the number of special education students that need to be served. So eventually, I just wanted to get to a number that would solve the problem. If you could help us with that, but I want to know how the basic allotment's triggered on their behalf.
So school systems will they designate students for special education for the purpose of the school finance system. They designate special education by where the student is placed. About 60% of our special education students are educated in their general education classroom. And maybe they have a push-in support. Maybe there's just a minor adjustment that's made in the curricular delivery. The other 40% are educated typically in some variation of not the general education classroom. This could be what's sometimes called resource room or self-contained. In some cases, students actually go to a separate school. It's a day placement location. In some cases, in a very few cases, they get full-blown residential care 24/7. And so depending upon that placement, you fund the special education formulas. But your specific question has to do with one aspect of that, which is when a student is in general education, you've got your 6160 basic allotment, and then you got your extra sped funding on top of that. When a student is removed from general education for some or all of the day, they don't actually generate the basic allotment anymore. I think there's maybe 36 people in the state that understand this. So this
is very important.
And so we call it the regular program offset. It has been a feature of Texas law for, 50 plus years. And so what that means is that the special education funding formulas, for those students, it's very large infusion, but that's not funding in addition to the basic allotment. And for that particular group of students, for that portion of their day, they are offset and don't receive the basic allotment during that portion of their day.
Because they moved out.
So what would it take to fix that, to align those goals based on expectations and need? What kind of number?
So I think that there's a variety of ways that you could potentially structure a policy change to do this. One is funding neutral, so that there's no longer a regular program offset, but that would also then involve adjusting all those weights down in special education for the students who are moved off. And then the other is funding additive. And if they're funding additive, most of the conversations in special education end up being pretty large numbers.
With the special education allotment, there's a provision that says at least 55% of the special education allotment must be spent on special education students. Why is that not 100%? And I know that's a policy decision.
It's because that's what's
but
already in the law.
Do you know any trends or any other supports? Any reasons?
Independent of that spending requirement, you should know that there's another requirement that school districts face. So even if that spending requirement was not in state law, there would be probably something else that's more strict, and it's what's referred to as maintenance of effort. And so inside of a school district's budget, they can basically never reduce special education spending in year 2 versus year 1, ever. And so for most districts, that 55% number is totally irrelevant because of there's a lot of asterisks to what I just said under federal law, but that's a federal law requirement. So whether that state law requirement's tightened up or not, that federal law requirement is still there. The spending requirements require districts obviously to track things from an accounting standpoint very clearly. If they end up not meeting the spending requirement in a given fiscal year, they sometimes have to throw a bunch of extra money in right at the end of the year in order to meet that spending requirement. So they can cause some weird externalities from an accounting perspective. I generally am not a fan of spending requirements writ large because I think they potentially cause more accounting work than they cause benefit in terms of operational outcomes. That being said, the spending requirements are there because the legislature says we're investing for this purpose. We want to know that money is being spent for this purpose.
Well, I know we'll have some testimony coming up later in the hearing that'll be very valuable for us on that, as yours has been as well. Certified teachers, where are we headed on those trends, and should we explore ways to incentivize teachers further to take rigorous pathways to get into the classroom?
Yeah, so in this year's annual report, if y'all look, there's a graph that's a fairly striking graph on page 8. And what it shows you is there's really 4 primary pathways to getting in the classroom. There's a new pathway called residency, which is exactly what you think it is. It's just like being a medical resident. I'm going to train for a year before I'm the teacher of record. There is then traditional undergraduate, which is what most people think about as teacher preparation. I went to Tech, went to their College of Education undergrad. My senior year, I did some time student teaching, and then I teach. There's alternative certification. This is generally career changers. And it's really broad in terms of the nature of what that can mean. It can mean literally no preparation. So I signed up for the preparation program on the same day I was hired to begin teaching. Or it can mean a fairly intense summer learning experience, a kind of semester-long learning experience. And then there is uncertified. And uncertified is a completely deregulated environment. It is, and it's what you would expect in a deregulated environment. In some cases, districts are doing things where they build a really structured apprentice model and are kind of like grooming folks to be highly effective teachers. And other folks, it's, you walked past the school today, you got hired, and you began teaching. So it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's a very broad experience base. And so what you see in that graph is, as of the most recent year, the majority of teachers are uncertified, meaning that all preparation activity, to the extent that there is any preparation activity, is left up entirely to school districts to figure out for themselves. Very few teachers anymore are going through undergraduate colleges of education. That's the traditional route. Alternative certification, which used to be very large, is largely disappearing as people are pursuing uncertification because there's no financial incentive for a teacher. If you look at a pay scale, I can start today as uncertified, I can start today as alt-certified, I can start today as a resident, and I get the same amount of money.
So we do our best to support our teachers that are in the profession. We do our best to incentivize rigorous certification processes, rigorous pathways to the classroom. We bring forth policy and funding that lets teachers know that we have their back and that also we're investing in them and that we'll keep a classroom safe so that they have a reasonable learning environment. But right now we have NAEP scores that show less than 1/3 of Texas 8th graders are proficient in math and reading, and many are below grade level. And then we have a growing number of uncertified teachers. Is it your opinion that we need to work with urgency on that correlation?
Yeah, I mean, today the state effectively spends no money from a state perspective preparing teachers. There's arguably a small amount of that's in your higher education bill pattern for College of Education. But there's really no state funds directed to teacher education or teacher preparation, which means that if someone wishes to become a teacher, the entirety of their preparation is up to how much money they want to personally spend becoming a teacher. That's essentially what it comes down to. And I think that we are setting people up who have passion and who have mission. We are setting them up for failure because teaching is not something you just decide to do and then start. It requires training and skill, understanding of the content areas. So I think I would completely agree and support that the need for the legislature to invest substantively in preparing people to become teachers is a part of the strategy that does need to be adopted in order for us to make real progress for kids.
Well, I know we're coming back again with our Teacher Bill of Rights that was modeled in other states. It passed out of the Senate. Not only is it across the board pay raises and other funding streams, but it is it's innovative ways to provide those supports. And we're listening.
Yeah, if I
any
remember
and all
correctly.
members and stakeholders that have their top of the list requests for what could be in a Teacher Bill of Rights beyond pay and safety, to make sure those supports are there to keep them excited about the profession and being in the classroom. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members, for your indulgence with the extended time.
Thank you, Senator Creighton. Senator Perry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Going to run through pretty quick. It's kind of determined upon you how quick.
I'll try.
So first of all, number one reason teachers are not staying in the classrooms and those that get an experience of the classroom during their student teaching or leaving that classroom is because of discipline, period. We talk about it. It's 800-pound gorilla. We tried to do something in the previous session, so we're still working. Senator Creighton office and I are working on it. But I need to know, so we have the SPED population and we have the non-SPED population. Both have internal classroom issues sometimes. Do y'all track the SPED population and the discipline, the non-SPED population with discipline? Do y'all have a
Yes,
tracking
sir.
of
We have data on that.
Can you get that to me? It would be critical as we go forward in this conversation. Secondly, and I'll give this background, I'm told that when there's an episode in a classroom, that the kids in the classroom stand out in the hallway while that child, whatever it is, if it's throwing chairs, if it's throwing things at the teacher, if it's just an outright fit, they stand out in the hallway and wait that event to subside. So the question I have for you, and you may not have this, but in facilities, rather than removing and interrupting a classroom experience for the day, do we have a place to move those children until that episode subsides and then try to work them through that? Is there places in the district, built facilities that accommodate that? Because I've seen video of these kids and you don't want to be close to them. It's dangerous.
The answer to your question is sometimes and in some places. In rural Texas, largely no.
So that would be an important consideration, would it not?
Yes,
that
sir.
we provide some sort of direction on what that room can be until that child is redirected.
Yes, sir.
Okay. You talk to the acuity. I'm telling you the numbers are normal kids get funded okay, but the number of kids that are the 60% population is off the charts, and the ones that are in that 40% demographic is twice that. So I'm looking forward to see what that does. Page 12, misconduct. Teachers, for those that are listening that are worried that there's no accountability, you have a number at 12,500 educator misconduct matters in 2023 alone. What do y'all track the disposition of what those were? Did
Yes.
teachers lose their jobs? Were they cursory, 10,000 foot, not a big deal? They got, I mean, can you give us some type of disposition of those 12,500 misconduct?
Yes, I can.
Because I think I'm not advocating for teachers to get carte blanche here and a free pass. Clearly, 12,500 educator misconduct complaints, there's an accountability system somewhere in the loop, right?
Yes, sir. And we conduct reviews, investigations of all the misconduct complaints that come in. We are typically the second investigator,
Okay.
so often you'll have CPS or other folks that have reviewed the case initially. They share those case files with us. That's the first phase of our investigation. I want to say about 61% of the misconduct reports that come to us after a preliminary investigation like that show that it was not actually misconduct or something else. So the
Sure.
teacher
And,
was absolved.
and I expect that or suspect that, but I don't want to have supposition.
Yeah,
based
we can
policy.
send you the data.
And then we're talking about major shifts in public education this session, last session, session before session, and session. I think somebody said, in 1800s or whatever, they were talking about water, education, and roads. Fast forward 2025, we're talking about water, education, and roads, and energy now. So not much changed, right? We're comparing to NAEPS. So, and I've had conversations with you with respect to STAR, and I know you're a fan of the rigor in STAR. I understand that, and I'm not disputing that it's bad or good.
Well, just to be clear, STAR is probably less rigorous than NAEP.
Okay, that's what I was fixing to ask.
Yeah.
So we now have a new target, so to speak. We're not changing STAR. I've heard file a bill. I've been told, file a bill. But my question of the day is, we seem to always have had this out here, but now we're focusing in on it a little bit more, that this is where we're at. My question of the day is teaching to STAR, if we teach to STAR, which I'm told we do, we can have a fundamental disagreement, yes or no. I'm just telling you what the teachers tell me. is that reflected in the NAEPs and not the ability of the teacher, what they're doing, but the content in which they're teaching? Is that considered when we compare our NAEPs? In
Yeah,
other words,
it's
because if we were teaching to NAEPs, I would anticipate NAEP scores going up. So set all the metrics aside, are we teaching our kids to be productive citizens going forward is the first question. And I know you have to have a standard, but it really concerns me when we start laser focusing, as we do every other session or two. We get into these conversations. What's the metrics? And we have to have a standard. I love the national standard conversation, by the way, versus something we've done. But that aside, are the NAEP stars improved if we had taught NAEPs for the last 10 years? You think there's a crossover there?
It's possible, but not likely significant. What I'll say is that the underlying curriculum that STAR is based on is the TEKS, and the underlying curriculum that NAEP is based on is definitely not the TEKS. It's like a 40 or 50 year, somewhat nebulous set of concepts set a long time ago. They are still testing reading and math. We're testing reading and math, but we're testing based upon our aligned curriculum standards. So, like, for example, in our math standards, we have a pretty substantive dose related to money management. So this is counting change at the lower grade levels. It's getting into sort of banking and interest calculations at the upper grade levels. You generally don't see that reflected on NAEP, but you do see it reflected on STAR. So the NAEP scores are much more a very traditional approach to mathematics instruction, but asked in word problems that require you to be able to think in
Critical thinking.
about math abstractly.
So you ripped the Band-Aid off the score, basically, if you're paying attention to what you just said. Now, I know you probably don't see it that way.
I just want to make sure I understood what you said, but maybe I did.
We have STAR, and we have that curriculum, and I'm not debating merits either way. We teach more than what what NAEPs would encompass. In other words, our curriculum during the day has other things that we find important, and it's based on TEKS. We're measuring a test that's not TEKS-based, and arguably is more of the principal STEM, kind of math and reading and those things. So I just say, as we have these conversations, somewhere in here, and I'm not disputing the fact that we teach outside of math and reading is not important for a whole rounded school experience. I'd say if you're really good in those disciplines, you have the critical thinking capacity to become good at money management, right? I don't know, but it's not an easy thing. But it bothers me that we have a standard here and a standard here, and it's an apples to oranges. If you're really looking at it, it's apples to oranges. Unless you can make the point that what NAEPS is teaching is covered the same or as better under the TEKS. And if it is, move on. If it's not, we need to really be careful when that becomes our standard, whether NAEPS is the standard or STAR standard. It's tough. I don't think we're there yet. So
I think I look at NAEP directionally. That's the reason why I think it's important. So directionally, are we moving one way or the other? What I will say is that the data that we get back from NAEP is largely consistent with the directional information we get back from STAR.
If you looked at the things that are focused on through NAEPS, i.e. reading and math, and you care about them as you did in here, is the TEKS equivalent to what's under NAEPS, in your opinion, that we should be getting the same?
No, there are. I wouldn't characterize it as apples to oranges. I would characterize it as like Washington Delicious apples versus Granny Smith or something like that. So they're not the same thing. There's some overlap. But again, STAR data has showed us in the last 2 years performance declines entirely consistent with NAEP data.
Sure, and I get that analogy. Pretty quick here, finishing up. We are not supporting our teachers in training on how to teach in the classroom. Concerns me a lot when we spend $25 billion plus in higher ed. So I don't know where to point the blame, but I'm going to start there. It's not your problem, but I would say, and I don't know that this is happening, the quicker you can get a student of education in the classroom, preferably second semester. They will determine really quick whether they want to be there as a professional or not. It may reduce the pool, but then we can start from there and see what's going on in the classroom where people don't get to teach, because that's all they want to do is teach. We don't have it set up for that right now. But I think suggestions on how to get the academic culture out there, making sure our teachers are prepped. And the only best thing that you can do to get a teacher or any profession prepped is experience on what they're just studying. So teacher in the classroom, veterinarian in the clinics early, that's proved to be a success model. Get those people involved in that process. That's my suggestion. So if you've got ideas on what the academic curriculum at the higher ed university systems need to reflect in the way of clinics, instead of third or fourth year in before they ever have exposure to those kids, we're not going to change that direction.
I'm in complete agreement. What you have to do with prospective teachers is get them into schools as early as possible so that they can, one, some people realize, you know what, maybe real estate's for me. But two, the people that stay grow and they begin to learn the skills associated with that school.
I'm going to leave you with the discipline issue. Number one reason they're leaving is discipline. Number two, they don't have the support of the district. The discipline bills that we'll file will give AG and encourage districts to go after these lawsuits that they run from. The districts run from lawsuits. You can't run from lawsuits anymore. As bad as I hate lawyers and lawsuits sometimes, I said sometimes. Sometimes lawsuits are what changes things for the positive, right? There's an element to it where you get to air what's going on. It's not just public schools. We've seen it in 2 or 3 other genres of violence in the workforce. If we leave here without rules in place that would help at least prevent another teacher's eye from being ripped out with a hanger in the classroom, if we don't fix that before we leave here, shame on us. But it has to start with the ability to separate the troubled child from the population as a whole, at least until they figure out what's going on. So day placement centers do that. The safe room aspect has to be a conversation. I'll need experts to figure out what that looks like. It is no longer acceptable for a teacher in a classroom to be assaulted and that child remains in that classroom. And you got to start early. The other ones are watching, and it isn't fair to anybody. Thank you.
Senator Sabarini.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me say that some of my best friends and the people I love most are lawyers. Beginning on page 4 of your document, Commissioner, you have a graphic about school funding and the annual expenditure per student. It goes through 22-23. We've heard conflicting information about the level of funding per student. Based on your perspective and your data, how does our expenditure per student compare to the nationwide average?
We're below, say, the average mark, but what I also say is that the funding comparisons are a bit complex. We have 2 extra grades compared to a decent number of states. So we pay for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds in public school via pre-K. There's at least a couple of states that still don't pay for kindergarten. And so that actually always throws off the state funding comparisons. But that being said, there are this is the data set that the feds collect and they report on it, and we're below the 25 mark, so sort of below the halfway mark on a per pupil basis. I always think that they need to redo the math to look holistically per kid, because again, we start with a 4-year-old and another state starts with a 6-year-old. That's an extra $20,000 in funding per kid over their lifetime that's never even counted. So that's. But the short answer to your question is we're generally below the average mark.
So where exactly would we be ranked?
Oh, I don't know. I'd have to look that up, and in part it depends on whose methodology you use in terms of what funding is counted. Like, for example, I mentioned that there's about $3 billion a year that the legislature appropriates directly to public schools, except it doesn't show up in public school budgets, and so I don't know if that even shows up in those federal reports.
So you have data through 22, 23.
Yes, ma'am.
What is your projection for 25, 26?
We have probably a slightly updated version of this that we publish. Y'all have a funding transparency rider you require of us to publish. I want to say it's like rider 59, and so I can send your office a link to that. It's up on our website. But if you bear with me just one second, I will find a copy of this. Because I think we have estimates now for. So the only thing that we can project forward is this money without federal funds and this money without full accuracy from district revenue that's not foundation school program. And that is a substantial amount of revenue. So like one aspect of the money that y'all spend that's not in the FSP is instructional materials allotment, which is $1 billion every 2 years. So with that caveat, if you go to page 4 of our Rider Transparency Report, I'll send this to you. It showed that 23, the same period that you have here, the total spend was $61.7 billion. That was, so baseline, this same bar that you're looking at, $61.7 billion. And the very next year, it's $65.8 billion. And that's fiscal year 24. That's the 23-24 school year. And then we're projecting $67.4 billion for the year after that. So that would have been a $4 billion increase between 23 and 24, and then a $3 billion increase between 24 and 25. So you're substantively increasing funding even beyond this graph. What I don't know is that enough to offset the decline in federal funds that districts are going to experience in the year that we're currently in? And I won't be able to tell you that for probably another year.
Okay, thank you so much. On page 9 of your document, you list $400 million as a contingency for Senate Bill 260 and the foundation school program related to the school safety allotment.
Yes, ma'am.
That would bring it to $766 million. Do you think that's sufficient to meet the school district's needs?
It depends a lot on the local managerial decisions that school districts make. So if you want a sworn officer at every one of your campuses, there are 9,000 campuses in Texas. That means you need 9,000 new sworn police officers, just as a frame of reference.
Which don't exist.
Which
in
don't
the state.
exist. And, the cost of a sworn officer sort of fully loaded is probably about $100,000 a year. But that's not what the legislature requires. The legislature requires somebody that's highly trained and skilled to show up and be on presence. And so we know of districts that have set up sort of a tiered staffing model. They have a sworn officer that's overseeing all of this. They have sort of junior apprentice officers underneath that, and then dedicated school specialties, school safety specialists. For districts that use that kind of model, this should be sufficient. For districts that are trying to have sworn officers at every campus, again, you're not going to get there until it's $100,000 per campus. And again, that's for people that don't even exist, that can't be hired.
Thank you so much. Also on page 9, you have $4.1 billion for increased teacher compensation, including $50 million for teacher retirement system to incorporate the increased compensation.
Yes, ma'am.
How does TEA plan to expand the targeted financial incentives for special education teachers, including loan forgiveness and tuition reimbursement programs?
I think we do whatever the legislature tells us to do on those programs, and I cannot remember off the top of my head how those programs are structured. I am unaware of a proposal right now that expands those programs, but that could certainly be included. If I recall Senator Creighton's Teacher Bill of Rights, there was some additive money related to special education teachers having their certification fees waived. Also covering extra stipends for both bilingual and SPED certified teachers to go through preparation and then actually be hired.
Thank you so much. On page 12 of your document, you're requesting $17.7 million to expand investigative teams for complaints and misconduct. How would these additional resources improve response times and enforcement actions? to protect the teachers and students?
So it will certainly speed up our time from the notice of incident to conclusion of investigation. I can't remember exactly what we have internal SLAs, and we track all this internally. But there is we should be able to deal with both the volume increase associated with misconduct and general complaints and speed up resolution of those complaints. But I will say that the area of sort of teacher misconduct investigations is probably worthy of additional policymaking attention. The state of Texas has relative to other states in the country, a very strong framework to prevent passing the trash, but that does not mean it is a foolproof framework to prevent passing the trash. And so we're aware of cases where sort of existing statutory authority has, I think, limited our collective ability, both local school districts and our ability to be as effective as possible when need be.
Thank you. On page 14 of your document, you address special education. And Senate Bill 568 by Senator Betancourt, co-authored by a number of us in the Senate, proposes a shift to a service intensity-based formula for special ed funding. It was a key recommendation of our SPED Commission. What are the projected costs of implementing this new formula at both the state and district levels?
The answer to that question is somewhat complex. Portions of the new formula we have pretty precisely estimated, and I can't remember with specificity, but let's call it, say, $250 million a year or something like that. But then there are portions of the implementation that you can do on a funding neutral basis. And so then it becomes a question of how much additional funds you want to put into the special ed allotment above and beyond. So you would need to, for basic bill implementation, you need at least about, and I need to go back and look at the cost estimate or fiscal note on that bill, but you're going to need at least some amount of money for bill implementation. I want to say it's maybe $250 million a year. That would be $500 million in biennial terms. But then the rest of it is how much additional special education formula funding do you want to run through the new structured formulas?
What improved student outcomes would you expect from this different formula?
So what we have with the status quo in the state is substantive cost asymmetry, arbitrage problems. I have to spend $20,000 to support a given student. I receive $10,000 to support a given student. What that means is that for that student, you have to find that money from other students. And so what we would expect is that the nature of the service mix that districts are offering better match their IEP plans, meaning if I have, say, dedicated dyslexia intervention that is deemed necessary for a student, but I don't have enough money to pay for training of new dyslexia staff members so that I can service that dyslexia, then it doesn't matter that I have the written requirement. I can't actually do it. I don't have the people that are employed. So much of the funding infusion is really related to ensuring that you have sufficient staff capacity to do what we know needs to be done to support students in special education.
Thank you. On page 15 of your document, you talk about strategic teacher compensation. Specifically, how would you structure long-term incentives to retain the special ed teachers and reduce their turnover?
Well, there's a lot of things that affect teacher turnover. Some of those have nothing to do with money, as Senator Perry mentioned. Discipline, working conditions. If you pay somebody $100,000, but you demand 90 hours a week from them, eventually they're going to quit. So there are things unrelated to pay that matter for teacher turnover, but pay also matters. If I can leave this profession and immediately make a $20,000 pay raise with my skills in another profession, then that's when compensation really starts to matter. So I think about this as the nature of pay raises. I think you heard the Texas School for the Deaf testify earlier that their starting pay for teachers is $61,000. And if you think about a 22-year-old bachelor degree professional, $61,000 is generally a good wage for a 22-year-old. But $61,000 after you've worked 60 hours a week, you've developed a tremendous amount of specialized expertise, and you've done that 10 years of your life, and now maybe I'm only making $68,000 a year. that's a real problem. So, so largely when we think about strategic compensation, I'm thinking about raises, the way raises are structured so that people don't quit because we're not giving them pay raises. Unfortunately, the standard compensation system in school districts around the state is tremendously flat. You start at $61,000, 20 years later, you're making $71,000. And so it's not so much raising that starting pay that's the real problem. It's that nobody ever gets a pay raise, and so everybody quits eventually. That's the thing that we have to think about in terms of structured increases in compensation.
Do you think there should be a different structure for special ed teachers?
I mean, so the nature of the specialty requires typically a higher degree of training and that kind of specialization. So I think it is wise, and most districts do offer some degree of stipend for their dedicated special educators.
Well, thank you for your answers. You answer so easily. Here's one you probably don't want to answer, but I feel compelled to ask it. What impact would abolishing the U.S. Department of Education have on TEA?
Yeah, and I heard Senator West ask that question. So I don't think we would know the answer to the question, and maybe it would only make everyone's lives a little easier. The reason why I say we don't really know is almost all those federal programs that you were noting on that page of the LBB's report predate the existence of the Federal Department of Education. So a conversation about the structure of cabinet-level agencies is actually not the same thing as the structure of federal funding for public education, and so that's the reason why I don't think we would know. I would wait to see what act of Congress is filed on that.
Have you heard of anyone interested in abolishing TEA?
I have.
You have? And what would be the impact of that?
You would no longer have oversight over public education as a state.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. Senator Hinojosa?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, Commissioner. My question relates to the authority of TEA to be able to investigate complaints from school districts when there's conflict between the Board of Trustees and the administration, or there are issues dealing with financial mismanagement, or it could be also criminal behavior. What is your authority to be able to investigate those type of complaints?
We have authority under the Special Investigation Statute to investigate any alleged violation of the Education Code, and by that sort of government code, election code, those sorts of things. The processes are set up to provide school districts with a great deal of due process. School districts, of course, are not. They're not like people. They're legal creations of the state. So y'all have given school districts the ability to challenge decisions of your regulatory oversight agency and sort of set up a bunch of due process requirements. Once we go through all of those due process requirements, assuming then we end with the decision of something like a conservator, then the conservator tends to be all-powerful in that school district. But prior to the placement of the conservator, there's really no direct authority to direct activity inside of a school district one way or the other.
And actually, while TEA is conducting a special investigation, once it goes through the due process, the TEA does not have any authority or any ability to be able to stop any other contract that the school board, which is under special investigation, can enter into on a long-term basis or provide salary compensation for certain consultants over a long period of time.
That's correct. I mean, once a contract is signed, that contract is binding between the two legal entities that sign that contract. Once a conservator has been placed, you can consider what changes are possible under the contract. But again, if the contract is ironclad and it's lawful, you're not breaking it. You're just buying yourself out of it.
And many times that would lead to costly litigation.
Many times it would, yes.
So could you possibly use the authority to be able to have proper oversight of a school district contracts, entering into contracts or other binding agreements from the time that you start the special investigation until you make a decision whether or not you will place a management board
Yep.
of the school district?
Yeah, if we had that authority, then in areas where there are contract malfeasance allegations, which unfortunately does happen, then we would have an additional tool to prevent any misspending while we wait for the investigation to play out.
And that misspending has actually happened.
It has, yes, sir.
Okay. I guess another issue, and you were asked by Senator Savadini, dealing with sexual abuse involving students that are school-related, and also solicitation of a relationship with a student or minor. Has there been an increase in that type of conduct in our schools? First of all, you have jurisdiction over public schools and charter schools.
Correct.
To investigate those type of complaints. Has there been an increase over the years?
I think without having the data in front of me, I think generally the answer is yes. There has been an increase. I think these are larger trends, like over the last 10 years. I would need to consult our data with specificity to show the case counts that have been sustained by years. In some cases, that may be because there is more of this misconduct happening. In other cases, it may be because state policy has significantly strengthened in this area. Our systems are actually much more aggressive at identifying and then going after it. So,
And actually, you're right. I think we have passed legislation to try to stop gypsy teachers, if you will, and pass the trash that used to happen before. So you have jurisdiction over private schools?
there's a private schools have access to the Do Not Hire registry, and I can't remember if they're prohibited from using folks on the Do Not Hire registry. I can't remember that off the top of my head. But other than that specific interaction they have with the Do Not Hire registry, we do not have jurisdiction over private schools.
Well, do you keep track of all the teachers who conduct sexual misconduct or have solicit a relationship with a minor or a student? You keep track of those numbers, do you not?
Yes, sir. Yes.
And that's public schools and charter schools.
Yes, sir. What I'm trying to think is I think private schools might be mandatory reporters on certified staff as well. So I think they may be in our Do Not Hire registry numbers as well, but I'd have to double check that.
Yes.
Okay. Moving on from that issue, because I think it's a very important issue, especially now that we're considering passing vouchers or savings accounts, that we find out exactly what's going on in our school systems, both public, charter, and private.
Yes, sir.
The other issue is, as you know, we had a lot of issues in the past when there was an increase in the appraisal of property due to inflation and other reasons. We have some of the smaller school districts where the county appraisal district evaluation of the appraised property differs from that from the state. And obviously there seems to be, they have 2 years, I think. If there's a difference of 5%, they have 2 years to
That's
try
right.
to correct that situation.
And if it's more than 10%, it's immediate.
Correct. And as we try to find a way to solve this problem and help some of the school districts sort of not face a cliff and sort of do it in phases. Do you have any suggestions of maybe having the school district initially pay 75%, then 50%, then 25%, so they would not be hit so hard once the 2 years are up?
Yeah, I think that exact proposal makes a lot of sense to us. We've tried to analyze this, and the part of it is ensuring that school districts have the authority to resolve these problems. And so school districts vote for the CAD members, but all of the school districts in a given county may not actually represent sort of majority authority over the CAD. And so if the CAD is inaccurately appraising school districts and the school districts relying on the CAD, the one question I think you would have as policymakers is, have we given school districts enough tools to fix that problem? And then the question is, how much time do they need to fix that problem? And the idea of providing sort of supplemental grants for schools that find themselves in this position, so that they have time to work those problems out, potentially in the model that you just discussed, 75, 50, 25. Y'all could build that in as a sort of like an automatic supplement in the foundation school program, which would, I think, help a number of districts around the state that find themselves in this particular problem.
And the school districts don't have much influence or authority over county appraisal districts, do they?
I mean, they can. So if you think of the collective power of all the school districts in a county, there's some relatively complex formula in your comptroller code. You need a comptroller probably to come testify on this, but they vote and they have board seats on that CAD. And I think in some places the school boards collectively would represent the majority of voting authority to elect people to a CADS, and therefore should represent the actual majority of the CAD. But it's not always the case that they do. And so they have some ability to influence it because they have governing control over the CADs, but it's shared governing control. And then, of course, you got to get the CAD chief appraiser to take action to fix it. So, these things can take time.
And many times the county appraisal district refuses to take any action or increase the.
That is correct. Yes.
And that's what causes the problem for.
Yeah, and if you're not a school district, that is a problem that every other local taxing jurisdiction can figure out how to deal with. But if you're a school district, you are in the foundation school program. And so the fact that you are on, your local values are below the state values, we look at that as if you have arbitrarily lowered your tax rates. And therefore, we do not fund you the entirety of the basic allotment. You get a pro rata reduction in funding under the foundation school program, just as if the local school board had decided to lower tax rates, which any school district can do.
Well, I'm working on legislation to try to find ways to make it much easier to help the local school districts that are facing this issue and a challenge in terms of the amount of money they're losing on funding. So I look forward to working with you on this issue.
Yeah, we're not perfect experts because this is where the interplay between comptroller law and like property tax law really comes in. But we have spent some time, so I'll follow up with you and share whatever observations we have.
And we're working with the comptroller's office also.
Excellent.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Senator Betancourt?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as usual, Commissioner, thanks for detailed testimony on such a wide-ranging set of topics. Just want to go back and cover some ground first. There was a lot of discussion in the school choice debate, a lot of focus on the basic allotment, but clearly what your math shows here that, is pretty, non-disputable is that you've had a 48% increase in total annual funding per student since 2011 up to about $15,503.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so, so my comment just straight is the focus debate only on school allotment the correct thing to do, or should we be looking at an entirety of the total funding that we're doing on a per pupil basis?
I'm certainly of the perspective that you want to look at the entirety of the foundation school program and all the supplemental funding that is authorized by the legislature. If you are looking at the basic allotment, you are deliberately looking at something like 45% of a district's budget from the state. So there's a lot more money in the foundation school program than just the BA.
Right, and in my opinion, such comparisons are misinformation because they don't even represent half of the total funding stream that goes to effectively on a per student basis. So thank you for that clarification.
We have, for your reference, on this year's annual report on page 7, one of the things that we tried to denote is what are all the components of funding that flow to school systems. And I think we've tried to make a pretty comprehensive list here of all of them. And so what you'll notice is there's a difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 and M&O. And the total amount of M&O that flowed in the 23-24 school year was estimated to be $10,800 per kid. So if you say that funding was only $61.60 per kid, that is clearly inaccurate. So the total funding in just the M&O portions of the formulas was about 10,800. And every one of those little bullets that you see on page 7 denotes how that, what the funding component is. The very first one, the regular program or the basic allotment. But you can see there's like 40 other bullets on that list. We've also, because this comes up from time to time, we've separated it so you can see what is attendance-based, where if a kid doesn't show up on a given day, the funding is adjusted, versus what is enrollment-based, which is fixed fee for the whole year, and then different ways that different funding elements are structured.
That's, well, and I agree. If you look at this from the standpoint of M&O, the basic allotment's about 56% of roughly, ballpark.
That's right.
If you look at the total all-in
For INS and federal.
it's, drops to almost 40%.
Right.
Okay. And importantly, it does include interest and sinking as well as federal dollars too, for the $15,500 number that you mentioned.
That's right, it does. That includes INS funds and that includes federal funds.
Right. So now, what your first exceptional item, I think we've discussed it, but you're asking for $17.7 million to continue the complaints of misconduct investigation. We have had a long history in the Senate of leading on those bills since Senate Bill 7 in 2017, I believe, or maybe it was earlier, as well as other versions of the bills, like Senator Colcourse trying to get tri-agencies or multiple agencies involved. Now, by looking at this mathematics here, okay, I think that's a 40% increase in total educator misconduct reports in 2 years.
Yeah, that's, I think back to Senator Hinojos' question, yes.
Right. And so without this money, I think the public would have a major problem with their thinking that we're doing something about teacher misconduct. True?
We wouldn't be able to execute any state oversight of the Do Not Hire Registry or the teacher certification process.
Right, which would put everything we've done in full reverse.
That's right.
Because I think it's so important. I remember when Senator West introduced me to the concept of passing the trash in 2015 when I was a rookie member of the Education Committee. And I was pretty horrified by what I heard. Now, we have managed to set up a system that works in the public school system. We've got it works in the charter school system. The private school system is have opted in on this because
I believe so, but I'll need to do some more research on that to get back.
well, I do know if there's a criminal charge at somebody on a Saturday, they know about it on a Monday. Okay, so there's clearly activity on it, and we've actually passed an amendment. It was last amendment on the ESA bill to make it absolutely clear that we weren't going to have any type of teacher misconduct issues with using an ESA.
Senator Betancourt, can I interrupt, ask, because I want to make sure I understood what you just said. So the private schools do have to report it, and they also have access to the information? Is that
They
what
have access to the information.
and they have to report it?
I believe they have to.
I think we need to clarify that.
I think that is true.
There's a lot of I think so's.
I think that is true for certified educators, and this gets back to a point that Senator Creighton raised before. We have a relatively large grouping, and it's growing, of uncertified educators.
In both public and private schools?
Well, a private school educator doesn't have to be certified, but they might be certified.
Okay.
If it is a certified educator, we track it, and we have a pretty robust oversight system. If it is a non-certified educator, there's a subset of those that are tracked related to public school employees, but not necessarily private school employees. Okay. And so the fact that we have begun to shift away from certification statewide also means a weakening of this oversight structure related to student safety.
Well, I suggest someone fix that who's going to carry that.
Thank you,
Senator
Madam Chair.
Betancourt, you sound
bill-
like a likely suspect.
Right, the bill is coming,
Well,
right?
I mean, we got to protect our kids. I'm very
No, bottom
very
line.
strong on this, so I don't.
No, and that's why I wanted to point this out, because we do find loopholes. We found a contractor loophole, and we're going to have a bill that tightens all that up.
Thank you, Senator Betancourt. I'm
substantially.
sorry to interrupt. Please
No,
proceed at full steam ahead.
No, I agree.
Just-
Now, something else that I think we have to do something on, I think it's just preposterously bad public policy that we've got a group of school districts that sue repeatedly every year on A through F. Because this train wrecks the entire system's ability to respond to how are we doing? What gets measured gets fixed. Where is your school district compared to their peers? Where is the school compared to other schools within the district? And unfortunately, since the passage of Senate Bill 1365, which really helped with an original lawsuit by, of all people, HISD, we're now locked up into 2 years of this litigation. And quite frankly, they find a favorable judge in Travis County, and then it has to be appealed to now the 15th Court of Appeals. Does any other state just let schools basically file suit like this ad infinitum forever? Or is that the general rule that we're violating in Texas? Because I think it's really bad public policy, and it leads to a preposterous outcome that we've got an accountability system, but we no longer use it.
Yeah, I can't speak to the legal posture in other states. I can say that these school districts are not legal entities like people. They are creations of the state, and you explicitly authorize them to use the money that you give them to sue you. So
You can fix that too, sir, Court.
Madam Chair, I have a bill coming on that exact situation. Next. Now, so we're 2 for 2. Let's try for 3 for 3. On your national comparison, I'm really concerned by the 4th grade math versus 8th grade math swing, because that's a 15-point delta differential negative. Now, I assume that you'd mentioned issues with overall performance. We talked about A through F. I assume the 8th grade math cohort is affected by COVID more than the 4th grade math COVID. But
I mean, they're both affected. Mathematics proficiency over the years is going to be contingent upon continued growth in mathematical knowledge, but there's some foundational mathematical skills that are developed between 2nd and 4th grade that are pretty profound, including the memorizing your times tables and the beginnings of the understanding of ratios. And so if you happen to turn off school for an extended period of time for kids that were in that particular age bracket, those kids are going to have a real hard time with calculus by the time they get there.
You're going to have a hard time with Algebra 1.
They're going to have a hard time with a lot of math.
Well, that's what I'm concerned for the committee, that what you see here is a COVID chasm, for lack of better description.
Some of this is COVID. I think some of this is not just COVID, and it's, again, worthy of all of the efforts related to curriculum with teacher training and preparation, the supports that are provided related to school leadership. This is a multifaceted, complex problem.
And this goes to Senator Creighton's questions about this area with you. I noticed there was quite a bit of positive media about Louisiana having all of their teachers read The Science of Reading.
Yep.
That seemed to be a book or a publication that they taught to and they actually trained to. Is that the key point?
It is, and y'all have actually already done this. You're maybe familiar with Reading Academies. So Reading Academies delivers essentially an expanded version of what's referred to as the letters training, which is what they did in Louisiana, what they've done in Mississippi and Alabama and a few places that has seen dramatic improvements in those states. You have not seen inherently dramatic improvements in our state, and for one big reason, we were actually already beating the pants off of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, so they're in the process of catching up with us. However, the investments that y'all are making in integrated training of the teachers and curriculum is sort of the next phase of this work. So one of the exceptional items that I have is tied to training teachers on high-quality instructional materials that the state's now making available to them. So I think this is a way for us to go even farther than we have been historically.
I noticed that exceptional item, which is why I was asking about it, because I think we have to take the next step up. And I'm happy that Louisiana has abandoned "C'est le bon temps, oui, n'est-ce pas?" and is now teaching the science of reading and catching up, but we need to take that next step to stay ahead.
Yep.
If I could, Madam Chair, I've got one final question.
Sure.
I want to talk about property taxes because I think, Madam Chair, especially with your leadership and members of the committee, we put an extraordinary amount of $51 billion of funding in. It is the number one item in the budget at this point in time. And I want to explain, just if I can, to the public, a concept that's really simple, and I think you'll agree with me, Commissioner. If you don't put the money of a property tax cut into the year that you need to get it to the taxpayer, nothing happens. Part of what we hear is kind of a falsetto argument. Well, this is old compression versus new compression, and old homestead exemptions versus new homestead exemptions. And in my mind, that's all poppycock, because while it mathematically adds up, each biennium, the legislature has to make a commitment to pay for what's occurred and then to also pay for more. Am I missing something?
No, that's correct.
Now, and part of it is that, as we know in school finance, there's a lot of buckets. It gets very complicated. But if I split it up for the taxpayers to understand that we have ongoing compression that we have to pay for and ongoing homestead exemptions that we have to pay for. If the public votes themselves a increase in the homestead exemption, which I believe will happen at 80 some odd percent if they're given the opportunity again, and this body has been very strong with that, then we'll have to fund it, and we'll have to keep funding it. And our ongoing compression, which really started in earnest from 2019 on,
Right.
okay, also requires money. And it's really the combination of those two that gets you the positive results each and every year. Am I missing?
Yeah, that is right. I'll state it one different way. You have, under state law, you have a mechanism so that property value growth results in property tax rate cuts, but it is it does allow for some net increase in total tax collections.
Right.
So
2.5% hard coded on a school district.
So in addition to what is baked into law to keep the state and local share balanced and to keep property tax rates declining as values go up, you would need to take affirmative steps legislatively each session to drive it down further. And
Right.
so an affirmative state would, for example, be an additional $40,000 increase in the homestead exemption. An affirmative step would be, for example, an additional 3 cents of compression on top of the sort of automatic compression that occurs.
Right, because without that, right now, Madam Chair, with your budget, this SB1, we've got about 6.8 pennies of state compression percentage that we're estimating coming on a reduction. That would save average a homeowner about $133 if the per year. On the homestead exemption, with the affirmative increase, which is a 40% increase that everyone in this committee has signed up as a joint author, that would save another $363. So we're looking at just with what has been currently budgeted and on the table now, of about $496 on a per average basis per homestead.
Yep. What I would add, I think I testified to this in front of this committee, I don't know, a couple months ago, and provided a chart then. But if you think about the efforts that the legislature has made over the last, 5 or 6 sessions to reduce property tax collections, the graph that I showed you before is that up until Senate Bill 2 and the most recent legislative sessions, those efforts have reduced property tax growth, but not actually reduced property tax payments from people. And Senate Bill 2 was the first time that you actually really did shrink net the total amount of taxes paid by taxpayers all over the state of Texas. And it was pretty substantive. So this, again, I think just speaks to your broader point of there's some mechanisms under law to try to keep value growth from from constantly causing tax increases, but you will need to take additional steps each session if you want to actually reduce total tax collections.
Right, and that's why, but the SB2 was, that was such a landmark bill. And then it did ended us costing us a little bit more than was budgeted for. Like we had,
yes,
we thought it was 18 billion, but it clocked in at 22.7.
It was the largest property tax relief ever provided by the state of Texas.
You know, Madam Chair, it was the greatest, the hugest. It was the largest. Everybody here voted.
I have a pretty large margin.
It was wonderfulness, wonderfulness. And
And again, if you think about the legislature's historic efforts to control property value or tax growth, many of those previous ones were sort of eaten by rapid value growth in the state. But the way that y'all structured Senate Bill 2 and the way that we implemented it, it actually overperformed. So you actually got even more property tax compression or property tax relief to your homeowners and property taxpayers than originally anticipated.
right. And I think at this point in time, while it might have been debatable that an $18 billion one could have been inflation, yes, inflation, no, there's no debate on a $22.7 billion plan at this point. And thanks for your support on that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Bedcart, there's a couple other more questions, but I think it's important, I think it's a good segue to note, and you as chair of local government know this, according to the comptroller, just so this is out here, that because sometimes we do hear from our constituents, well, I didn't see my property taxes, I saw some, but it wasn't as big as you said it was going to be and so forth, that between, this is according to the comptroller, these are the latest numbers, I believe, and I don't think the 24 numbers are out yet, but 22 to 23, there was a 10.13% decline in school district tax. Okay, so we put significant money, billions and billions, to get it down. But there's a 10.38% increase in cities, 10.76% in counties, and special districts, 22.23% increase. So we can spend billions and billions and billions and billions, but until we can get control of the rate of growth at the local level, then our constituents will continue to see their property tax not go down as much as they want. And so
I have a bill.
Mr. Chair of Local Government.
Yeah, that's right. Well, because
Anyway, I just want to throw that out there because, you do hear that from folks. Well, yeah, we hear what you're doing. We appreciate it. We've seen some, relief, but why didn't we see more? And I think this is probably
on that point. I think y'all may be aware of, but some of that in other counties, there's some sort of disaster provision related to this. There is also a disaster provision in the school finance system.
Right.
Those are commonly referred to as disaster pennies. And so as you consider this for other local taxing entities, you'll want to consider that for school districts as well.
no, that's a good suggestion.
that just something I wanted to point out.
No, and
But it was still the largest, the biggest, the greatest.
That's right. The hugest, the world record. And also too, I believe that bill put us over 50% on state share versus local, et cetera, share.
It did.
50.
That may be right. Probably just for M&O, because of course the state, so a very small portion in for INS.
About
But yeah.
50.6%.
Yep.
I think it was raised to. No, and Madam Chair, we do have that one when we get more time. We had unfortunately, some major taxing jurisdictions drive a Mack truck through the disaster exemptions, which were not appraised value increases, but pure tax rate increases.
And unfortunately, many of them in you and I's Senate districts. So.
Right, many of them are in our Senate districts, but I have a bill.
Oh.
And
I
that's
bet you do. Okay,
for.
thank you. Senator West, thank you for being so patient.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is an LBB question first, okay? In the LBB's summary of legislative budget estimates, what is that document used for?
Yes, sir. That document is just to provide information to the legislature regarding historical and recommended appropriation levels.
Okay, and is that, at what point in the process is that provided? Before we start constructing the budget or what?
Those are produced alongside the introduced bills for the House and Senate chambers.
Alongside? Okay, I want to point, and members, you don't have this, and Frank, I don't know what pages I can think of. On page 60 of the summary of legislative budget estimates. Do you have it there by chance?
What document are you looking at?
This is the summary of legislative budget estimates.
Okay. We don't have that, is that what you're saying?
Julie Lindsay, Legislative Budget Board. Are you talking about the bill summary, or are you talking about the legislative budget estimate by program or by strategy?
Legislative budget estimate.
There's two documents. We provide one by strategy and one by program.
This is by Article, this is Article 3, Agencies of Education. Does that help you?
Do you see? Oh, just keep going. We'll figure it out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a paragraph, and I think it's important. It says, and this is the non-FSP program, and administrative funding for the 26-27 biennium includes like $3.8 billion in general revenue funds, a decrease of $331 million from the 24-25 biennium. You know where? We're on the same
Yes.
page? Okay.
Yes.
All right. The net decrease is due primarily to the removal of $1.1 billion in one-time grant funding for school districts' safety and facility enhancement, and the exclusion of $233 million in the one-time unexpended balances for the instructional material and technology allotment, offset, again, this offset word, in part by an increase of $1 billion contingent on the enactment of the Education Savings Account program fiscal year 27. Help me understand that.
Yes, sir. So several of the components you mentioned. The first one, the $1.1 billion in one-time grant funding for school safety, those were school hardening type grants that were provided in the supplemental bill by the previous legislature.
One-time funding, okay.
Yes.
All right.
So those were, they were appropriated in fiscal year 23, but then carried forward and distributed to districts in the current biennium. The reduction in the one-time unexpended balances for instructional material, this just reflects there's a current practice where districts are allocated funding, but then there's some additional time for them to spend it down, draw it down. And so those unexpended balances are typically carried forward by districts. However, that is not they're retained, they're not removed. They still have access to those balances. It's just that the future biennium level, there's going to be a difference in funding, and it's related to those balances
I didn't
being
understand.
increased.
I understood the first
Okay, let
part.
me try again.
I didn't understand what you just said.
So districts have access to that funding. However, that results in an increase in the prior biennium in the base. So when it's compared to the 26-27 recommendations, it looks like a decrease because it's an increase that they received in the base biennium.
So
Right, one more
the short
time.
story is the reduction removes money from fiscal year 23 that was brought into 24. So what you're seeing is we're actually continuing the 24-25 appropriated base in 26-27. It was artificially increased just because of some allowabilities that they have. We pulled that back. So now they're just continuing at the normal funding level.
So just sometimes things look like we decreased it, but it's because we injected extra funds the previous biennium, maybe through one-time funding or through the supplemental, which is this case. It came through the supplemental, so it didn't really show up in the budget. So when they take that one time out, it looks like a decrease, but it really just goes back to what the original base funding was, right? Is that sort of
Correct.
Yes.
And in
I don't know if
part,
that's
you
easier,
know,
but
and, as budget writers, I understand,
Yeah.
understood exactly what you just said.
okay.
We need to make sure the public understands that, though, because what turns around is that the public thinks that we are defunding, if you will, those things. So we got to be a little bit more. I won't say we've got to describe it better. I'm not going to say be more transparent, but describe it better on that issue right there. Okay.
Yeah, understood.
And a few other questions, and this goes to the commissioner. Commissioner, as it relates to, in part, it's a Betancourt question also. How are we doing? I see the annual report, but how are we doing in terms of educating all kids in the state of Texas? Let me be more specific. You and I visited Cedar Hill ISD some years ago.
Yes, sir.
And there was a curriculum that was being developed by your agency and implemented by that particular school district. I assume that other school districts have also taken up that curriculum?
Some have, yes, sir.
And so what has been, describe that curriculum to the members of the Finance Committee and what the results have been.
So that was a pilot set of instructional materials that have now been recently approved by the State Board of Education, and they're available in reading language arts from kindergarten through 5th grade, and I think that's specifically what we saw, was a few elementary school reading classes, and then and also available in kindergarten through algebra and mathematics. That's marketed under the name of Bluebonnet, but it's a open education resource, meaning it's owned by the state of Texas, and as we get feedback based upon those materials, we can improve them over time. So we have preliminary outcomes data from a host of the pilot adoption districts, and the outcomes data is pretty compelling. There's nothing the content doesn't teach itself. It's still, you have to have thoughtful implementation, you have to have training of teachers, you have to have appropriate systems in place.
Would you speak into the microphone?
You have to have thoughtful implementation supports, but generally when we see districts implement it with fidelity, you see gains, and sometimes you can see double-digit gains in terms of students that are performing at grade level in either reading or math, depending upon which ones they're implementing.
So it's working.
It is generally working. It's
And
not
so-
foolproof, but it is working.
I understand that, nothing is. But the decision to utilize that is left to the local school district.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. And those that have accepted it have seen promise and gains from their kids.
Yeah, most have, and again, it depends on which year they're in. Sometimes the first year can be, a big curriculum swap can be a little rough, but yes, it's working. It's for those that have used the pilot materials, those that are going to choose to use the full blown materials. We would expect to see their outcomes steadily increase over time.
And that's regardless of their ethnicity, correct? That's
Say,
regardless of their ethnicity, the student.
Oh, yeah, regardless. It's a rising tide lifts all ships. And in fact, what we see is that student groups that have historically had lower levels of achievement tend to see faster improvements. It's sort of everybody gets better, and groups that have been historically behind are getting better faster.
Okay, a few other questions. As it relates to the issue of school district funding, we see more and more stories in the media about school districts closing down schools, deficit funding, complaints about the state not funding school districts, complaints about there was over $4 billion left on the table in terms of funding schools during the last biennium. Kind of give us an idea of your perspective on these allegations in as relates to our school districts, our public school districts.
So the legislature last session had an appropriation of $2 billion that was a contingent appropriation.
Right.
And the bill that it was contingent upon did not pass.
The voucher bill.
The legislature also had $2 billion of funding that was appropriated to public education, of new funding appropriated to public education that flowed. So there was an increase in state and local funding for most, not all, but for most districts on a per pupil basis over the last biennium. So the year that we're in, this is the second year of the biennium. Last year, compared that to the year before, district per pupil budgets generally were bigger as a function of state and local funds. However,
hold your point.
yeah, okay, thanks.
That increase, where was it as a part of the overall education budget?
There are three big buckets is where that increase showed up, and then it showed up in a bunch of other places based on prior law. But one was in Tier 2, the golden penny yield increased markedly, and so district budgets, every district has golden pennies, and so their budgets went up as a result of that. It also was new school safety funding.
All right, now, you and I and most of us understand Tier 2, but yet people in the public don't understand what Tier 2 is. Could you just briefly explain it to them?
So each ISD, they can optionally increase property taxes by up to 17 pennies, and it funds what's referred to as the enrichment tier or tier 2. It is new money in that district budget that does not have any legislative strings associated with it,
Other than
you have to increase your taxes to get it.
having an election to do it.
The first 5 pennies do not require an election.
Right.
And every penny after that does. And LBB's got numbers for you. Basically, nobody's below 5 pennies, and virtually everybody in a bunch of districts are above 5 pennies.
So then, as a part of the $2 billion that we're talking about, of increase, it's in tier 2,
That's right.
and it's based on, the first 5 pennies is based on the Board of Trustees.
Their local levels of taxation.
It's local levels of taxation. So if a school district didn't decide to increase their taxes at tier 2, then they didn't get that money.
No, every district in the state, even before that law was passed, was essentially already at 5 pennies. There might have been one at 4 pennies. And this was an increase in the amount of money you get per penny. So some districts just had that level of taxation, and therefore they got extra funding from it. Some districts decided that they were going to go in front of their voters and ask for higher levels of taxation, and they got even more money
So
because
those 5 pennies were matched.
That's right.
All right. Anything above and beyond that was subject to a vote of the people.
That's correct.
Okay. And some districts decided to go out, some didn't.
Basically, all the districts were already at 5 pennies, and then
I
some
understand the 5
districts,
pennies.
some
I'm talking
districts
about above
also
and
decided to
beyond.
go out and raise it even further.
Exactly. Okay.
And this is where the disaster pennies comes in, because if you had in a disaster declaration, you didn't have to ask the voters. You could just increase their taxes.
Does anyone know who invented those pennies? Because I just would like to know, because it's caused more confusion in this world than.
I think King Midas. I don't know. I don't know.
Do you know?
It's been around for a long time, and it was
long time.
partially a way to meet the state's constitutional obligations under Supreme Court rulings.
That's exactly right. Okay. So
All right.
a part
Sorry,
of
I digress. Go
No,
ahead.
no problem. I'm trying to get as much transparency as possible. As it relates to the $2 billion, a part of that went into tier 2.
1.2 billion was tier 2.
Okay, and to the extent that, and of the 5 pennies that all school districts.
And just be clear, we're talking per year numbers here. So 4 billion.
Well, I'd say, yeah. Okay, we're talking per year.
That's a
All right.
lot. Yeah.
So, most school districts had access to the first 5 pennies in the state.
Almost all.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was 1.2 billion, you said?
Yes.
All right. And to the extent that they went above and beyond that, was any additional monies from the $2 billion?
Flowed, yes. Yeah, if they had increased their tier 2 tax rate, they would have gotten even more money.
Based on the number of pennies they increased?
Automatically. yeah.
Okay. So where else did the $2 billion go?
The other 2 big chunks of money inside that $2 billion were school safety, which is about $200 million per year, although there was a one-time $1 billion allocation on top of that. And then there was instructional materials funds related to any materials that are approved by the State Board of Education. That money accrued in district accounts, but the board just took action for the first time on that in November. So districts are starting to draw down that new money today as we speak.
And so that $2 billion per year is allocated towards that particular bucket.
Those 3 buckets.
Well, I'm talking about this particular bucket.
Yeah.
Instructional material.
Yep.
Those monies districts will be able to draw down those monies based on the vote.
Of the state board, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they approved, I don't know, 100 products or something like that. If you buy anything on that list, you get
Okay, so
access to this.
so that's bucket 2. What's in the 3 buckets? School safety, instructional materials,
in tier 2.
and that's where the $2 billion went.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay,
I will say, like,
per year.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, WADA has also gone up. More teachers are participating in the teacher incentive allotment. That is also happening. Those also result in more money flows inside the district, and so that's part of what's drawing the funding increase that you show up in your supplemental.
All right, so we're discussing these school districts that we're seeing around the state, members, that are public school districts that are closing schools, okay? And there have been a myriad of complaints about why they're doing it. Would you please continue?
Yeah, so we've seen the same thing, basically deficit budgets and/or closed schools, and we always hear the same thing. They blame you, me, and from my perspective, it's not really accurate. You have increased per pupil allocations pretty consistently for school districts. And so their budget that's subject to legislative appropriations, legislative authorization has been going up. But two other things are happening that are outside of y'all's control. One is federal funds are drying up. And so in many cases, districts used one-time federal funds to cover increased operating expenses, for example, covering inflationary costs. And
ESSER funds?
those ESSER funds, yes. And the last year of ESSER funds was the last school year. So the school year that we are in now is the first year of what everyone has seen coming, the need to cut spending by about $1,000 a kid, because what the new federal funds were was about $1,000 per kid of extra money. And it was very clear to everybody, this was like 3 years, 4 years, that's it, and then you're done. So in some cases, to the extent that districts spent money on recurring expenses and used ESSER funds to cover that, the year that we're sitting in is a year of reckoning, and they would then have to either adopt a deficit budget, they would cut spending, they may, in some cases, close campuses. So it's the elimination of one-time supplemental federal funds has been, I think, a primary driver of that. And again, you can't forget about inflation has happened during this time period, and to some extent, people were using that one-time federal funds to address inflationary cost factors. So the second thing is local enrollment. If you were a district that for the last 20 years grew by 3% enrollment per year, you would always hire 3% more teachers than you needed to in year one because you knew you needed them to in year two. You'd be building schools, yada, yada, yada. Well, as you all have seen from the broader demographic data, as even from the LBB's presentation, the number of children, even though the weights are going up, the number of children is not going up anymore. And this shifted right at the start of COVID. And so we had historically grown statewide at about 60 to 70,000 kids a year, which is like a new Austin ISD emerging from the air every calendar year in Texas. But that stopped in 2021. And while that's flat statewide, and you would think, well, it's flat statewide, why would you need to close schools? This is going to vary pretty significantly from one community to another. New factory opens up, they're not closing schools, they're opening schools. Factory closes down, closing schools because kids move away. So that's something else that is happening is there are districts that, you know, they planned for 800 kids to show up into a school building, and instead there's only 150 kids or 200 kids in that school building. And it's pretty hard to operate that school building with only 150 kids. I mean, how do I give them a counselor? How do I give them an art, an arts extracurricular? And so then what you'll sometimes see is school districts will choose to consolidate so that they can have all the extracurricular, supplemental, all the extra resources.
Okay, let me ask you this question because I've got several more I need to ask you. As it relates to arguments about vouchers and the impact vouchers will have on public schools, specifically ADA, have you done an analysis of that?
We, as part of the normal legislative process, we're asked to do cost estimates to give to the LBB during the fiscal note process. We have done it. It's somewhat hard to predict because you can't tell what's going to happen. But this is something school districts, this type of thing, school districts are accustomed to because families move out of their community and they have demographers. They try to estimate what their enrollment is going to be.
And so you have not had the experience. I guess you've had the limited experience as it relates to the impact charter schools have had on public schools. And I guess you'd use a similar type of template to
That's right.
determination.
And the way, just so you know how those estimates come to y'all, we in October, before session every 2 years, ask the districts to give us their best estimate of what they think is going to happen over the next 2 years. We then subject that to additional analysis, give that to the LBB, and then they give final numbers to y'all.
And then we'll get some other numbers in March. Is that correct?
I think that's right. I think it's the right timeline.
March, okay. All right. As it relates to, if a district overestimates its student population, is there a true-up process?
Yeah, it occurs basically in September of every year.
And what is that true-up process?
I'm saying,
What is that true-up process?
well, so we from a cash flow perspective, we give districts money each month. It's a little more complicated than that, but based upon those estimates that they give us in October,
Of the previous year.
2 years in advance
Right.
in some cases. And so that's what they get paid throughout the course of each fiscal year, throughout the course of the biennium. But then by July, they will have uploaded their actual attendance data, their actual enrollment data. We'll have all of it synthesized. We then look at what they were entitled to under the Foundation School Program and adjust. And some districts get found money in September. Some districts were, perfect and there's no adjustment. And then districts that overestimated, they have to send us money back. Typically, the way that we do that is roll that into just an adjustment in their next monthly payments because they're going to continue to exist. But
Okay,
that's-
your voice is going.
Oh, I'm sorry. So they have to pay us back in September if they have overestimated the reality. That most of the time that's not actually a payment back to us. We just adjust their next funding flow accordingly.
Okay, now, if that school district or charter school has been found to misuse state dollars, how do we claw that money back?
Well, that's a different thing. Now you're talking about something that has to result in a special investigation.
I'm saying I'm assuming, I don't want to go through all the process.
Sure.
Assuming after an investigation has occurred, and we've seen misappropriation of state taxpayers' dollars, how are those monies repaid?
So that is independent of all of the things that I just talked to you about. So
Okay.
we pay them based upon estimates. They submit actuals to us. We get it. We will do attendance audits. We'll do sort of normal oversight duties. And if we find that they've said incorrect information to us, we make them pay that. And then if we do a special investigation because of some allegation of fraud or misuse, and there is some mismanagement of funding under state law, then we have them pay us back as a result of whatever that finding is.
All right, what's the source of payment, though? State dollars, taxpayer dollars?
I mean, so school districts, charters, they're generally getting taxpayer, these are state and local dollars. Sometimes there's federal funds, but those are, you can't typically under federal funds sort of
federal
mix and
funds,
match.
paper.
There's not the federal strings. So there's no state law prohibition against using state funds
Taxpayer
either in real time or state funds that have been added to your accumulated fund balance. Because once they're added to your fund balance, you can kind of.
All right, so members, here's the point I'm trying to make to you is this. If we have malfeasance on the part of a school district or a charter school, and it's found after special investigation that the state has to claw back money, then the source that's being used are tax dollars. Let me say that again. All right, public school, charters. They were found to have misspent $28 million in taxpayer dollars. $28 million. And guess what? They're on a payment plan. And they're using additional monies appropriated by taxpayers in order to pay us back for money they misappropriated. Something's wrong right there. And we need to take a look at that system in order to fix it. Let me go further. Have you been able to get the audit that was done by IDEA?
I'd have to verify with we got hundreds of thousands of pages of documentation, but we've turned it all over to you, so I think you probably already know the answer to that question.
No.
Yeah.
We're not going to play that game.
Well, I just don't.
What I'm saying to you is this. Have you been able to get an audit conducted by IDEA?
You likely know the answer better than I do.
I need them to know this.
Okay, so there is documentation that we got. There is some documentation that they have claimed attorney-client privilege over and not shared with us. And we, under state law, cannot pierce the veil of attorney-client privilege of any school system in the state, whether it's an ISD or a charter.
Okay. So you don't know whether or not you've received the information?
I can verify whether or not we've received the audit in question that you're talking about.
Okay, let me suggest that you have not received it.
Okay, I would agree then that we have not received it. How about that?
And here's the situation. And I understand attorney-client privilege, but a law firm members was used in order to do the audit. So they could turn around and then say that it's protected by attorney-client privilege.
I will tell you that under our special investigation procedures, this problem is vastly bigger than the one circumstance that we have school districts that regularly claim privilege on documents that I know you would otherwise want to have access to, we would have access to, and they do not get released to us in our investigative process.
And so, Senator Creighton,
I'm aware of like 3 or 4 active investigations where this is occurring right now.
as the chairman of the committee, I would hope that we would take a look at this, because it makes no sense to me. I've been found, the school district has been found, Madam Chair, they've committed malfeasance, and now that we're gonna turn around, we're gonna appropriate additional money to them in order to pay the taxpayers back money that's rightfully should have been kept in the first place, should not have been spent in the first place.
What about the ones who would have gotten an F, but instead of that coming public, they filed suit using taxpayer money?
That's a different deal altogether.
Well, I don't think it's that much.
Well, okay, but if you feel as though someone, a school district or a charter that's been found guilty of $28 million in malfeasance, they should then turn around and pay the state of Texas back, taxpayers back, by using taxpayer dollars. I mean, you're the chairman, but I don't think
I don't think that's what I said, Senator
Oh,
West.
then
I just
then I
made the
apologize.
point that there are other things that are unfair in the system
I
that need
agree
to be
with you.
looked at and fixed.
And that's why we're here to do that. And that's why I wanted to make sure I pointed it out to you. Again, last time on this issue, $28 million. $28 million. And it's a conservatorship, right, in place now.
Yes, sir.
And they're paying $5 million back per year using state taxpayer dollars in order to pay it back. Something's wrong with that.
File a bill. You can fix problems, you know that.
Well, as a Democrat, I got to make sure I have a Republican to help me fix it.
Well, talk to you.
That's what. Okay. I mean, I'm a realist. Okay. All right. Let me go. Okay. Okay. What's your definition of economic? What is the statutory definition of economically disadvantaged?
Free reduced.
And is it synonymous with low income?
Under statute, it's a free reduced lunch eligible student.
Okay. And in order to be eligible for free and reduced lunch, you have to have a certain.
Yeah, I think it's 185% of the poverty level for reduced and 200% for free. I could be wrong, but I think that's correct.
185%.
185%, yes, sir.
Okay. Not 500. Okay. Not 500.
The definition of economically disadvantaged is it's synonymous with being eligible for a free reduced lunch.
Okay. Let me ask you this. As it relates to the SHARS program, the Texas Health and Human Services Commission is alleging that federal government, specifically CCMS, and Senator Zaffirini just mentioned, is requiring the state to claw back these funds from local school districts. What role is your agency playing in that?
We, in our arrangement with HHSC, we do audits of SHARS spending in school districts. And so when we find SHARS spending problems, we share it with HHSC, and then they do all the enforcement. I am aware of some clawbacks from 2011. They're fairly limited, but there are some clawbacks that are happening now. And I think the more substantive issue is that there's been a significant reduction in eligible claimable accounts that happened, and school districts sort of found out about it after they had made another year's worth of expenditures on that. So I think there's a whole year's worth of expenditures that's a significant challenge for school districts. Not to mention the fact that on a go-forward basis, they're going to be short about $300 or $400 million a year net under what would have been reimbursement under SHARS.
And those are federal funds, right?
Those are all federal funds, yes.
Okay. Now, are you aware, is the commissioner asking for these funds to be clawed back? Is federal government asking for these funds to be clawed back?
Some of them, yes, some of them, no.
Okay, and are the school districts being made aware of those that need to be based on what the federal government is requiring and those that are not?
I believe so, yes. It's a kind of a joint communications responsibility between us and HHSC, but yes, I think the short answer is yes.
Okay, one other area of questioning. I've asked other agencies about the summer EBT program.
Yes, sir. I am familiar.
Make sure that the audience know what EBT is.
electronic benefits transfer.
Right.
And this in particular is paying for food for economically disadvantaged children.
During the summertime,
During
right.
the summertime, yeah. And they get basically, as like a spending account. I want to say it's $120 on it to buy, that their family can buy food with.
Okay, and I've asked your agency, do you have the authority to establish a database of these students? And I was told that you didn't have the authority.
Yeah, so I think the answer is not really.
Not really. You
That
don't-
we do not have the authority. And the issue at play is, I believe HHSC is required under federal regulations to directly market to all the families that are eligible, as opposed to just communicate to school systems. This is the database that they need. While we have information on students, we are not allowed to collect information on parents in our system. So we don't have any contact information for parents. So that's one of the key pieces of information that's required under the summer EBT program. And so we can't really satisfy what we understand to be the need to set this database up. HHSC could set up something where everybody can like just go and register on their own, but there's no direct way for us to sort of pre-register everybody.
All right, thank you.
That it? Or are you just looking?
Just checking off.
Okay. Don't want to cut you off.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, Senator Alvarado.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to go back to the issue about the uncertified teachers. So what is the cost for a teacher to become certified?
So
I'm sure it varies.
It does.
From their education level and experience.
So there are a few alternative certification programs that are basically all online, all go at your own pace. They have some interaction via Zoom, maybe with a coach, and potentially in person with a coach. That model is priced ballpark $4,000. And then it goes up from there.
That's the baseline, $4,000?
Yeah, it's about the cheapest anybody would pay for this preparation. And then there's like $100 or $200 certification exam that you have to take at the end of that. The residency models, so these are where the prospective teacher wants to go through like a whole year's worth of experience. That's more like $30,000. It kind of varies, but that's your low and that's your high.
Okay. And how long does it take?
Well, under state law, if you want to go the alternative certification route, you can say, I'd like to teach today and sign up for an educator preparation program today, get hired by our school district tomorrow and start. That's really not preparation, but that is at least a certification process. The flip side is a residency is a full year of preparation before you're allowed to be a teacher of record. So that's by and large the length of time.
What's the incentive for someone to become certified if they're already they're going to be on the hook for at least $4,000?
There is no incentive. I'm aware of no school district that has a differential in pay between certified and uncertified staff. It's possible there are. I mean, there's 1,200 school systems. But since there's no salary benefit, no wage benefit, the benefit to the candidate is because they would know they're better prepared. And there actually is a significant benefit for that person because if you're better prepared, you're much less likely to have a terrible first year of teaching and therefore more likely to actually stay teaching. But you don't really know that until after you're done. And there's no counterfactual to know, whether I was well prepared or not well prepared.
So did you say there's no financial benefit? Are they going to earn more if they're certified?
No.
More benefits? So there's no incentive then?
There's no real incentive under state law for an individual pursuing teaching as a career to become certified.
Maybe somebody has a bill for that. I think he left. But so, we hear a lot about this back home. And I know once y'all took over HISD, there were a lot of teachers who left. And I don't know, is the cause of this ballooning of uncertified teachers, or has it just been happening all over?
No, this is a broad statewide trend. Now, Houston has seen more rapid growth over the last 12 months in the number of uncertified teachers than many districts, but the trend is by no means limited to Houston. The statewide data there's 35,000 first-year teachers hired, and 54% of them were uncertified this last year. So that's clearly well beyond Houston.
I don't know where your chart went, but when did we see the first uptick?
It's
Okay, in your annual report.
This page.
Oh, I see, yeah.
The annual report.
Okay.
It's page.
I was just wondering what was going on when you saw the first significant uptick.
Well, so this is a little bit of a backstory. So charter schools are not required to hire certified teachers. Historically, have not been required to hire certified teachers. In 2015, the legislature gave legal flexibility to districts to opt out of any rule that didn't apply to a charter. It was called the District of Innovation. Districts began to do that, although they were slow to do this in teacher certification. The big accelerant to uncertified teachers happened during COVID. And you'll see that in these bars, and that's when the whole system seemed to shift to uncertified teachers en masse.
And I don't know, how or what we're going to address this, but I know that parents feel that if their child is being taught by an uncertified teacher, and I don't know, this is debatable, that they're not getting as good of an education. They're not as supervised as well versus certified, uncertified. I mean, I know both certified and uncertified that are great, and some that aren't. So, in terms of giving parents some comfort knowing that whether they're uncertified or certified, that they're getting the best quality education.
Yeah, it's a great policy question. So certification in and of itself has a fairly weak relationship to teacher quality. But that does not mean that preparation is not important. It's just there's a huge array of ways to prepare somebody for the rigors of the classroom. So if you know your content very well, or you understand the core of your content well, and you're explicitly taught on content, and you know classroom management very well, and you're given a mentor or a coach, those are your three magic ingredients. You can do that with certification. You can do it without certification, but those are important.
Okay.
So y'all have a state law in place that if a teacher is if a student is in a classroom and there's not a certified teacher there for more than 30 days, the parent is also supposed to get notified when that occurs. Although districts can also opt out of that requirement under the District of Innovation process as well.
Okay. Let me move on to the violations. Your presentation mentioned that statutory violation investigations have doubled. What factors have contributed to the doubling of general complaints from fiscal year 2019 to 23?
Boy, I don't know that I can analyze a root cause on this. I mean, part of it is we're all more angry at each other today than we were 5 years ago. I think COVID gave parents an unprecedented level of visibility into instructional practices. And because of the shift to remote instruction, social media is not doing anybody any favors. So I think there's a variety of things going on that's potentially driving the increase in both general complaints and specific issues related to teacher misconduct.
Okay. I know you have, obviously, you've taken over HISD. How many other schools have y'all taken over since the last legislative session?
Since the last session, maybe La Jolla. Since the year 2000, I want to say there's been 11 boards of managers.
And when you do that, how does that impact your bottom line budget? You have to hire more FTEs? You have to...
Generally, no. We have it's a very intense effort initially to recruit the board, make sure that they're trained to serve from the local community, and then recruit a superintendent and make sure that they're prepared to hit the ground running. But once that's done, that's done, and it's really the local school board's local superintendent leads the district. So we get more complaints that come up to us from those districts. It does take a little bit more attention, but it's not like a substantive change to our staffing footprint.
Okay. And since you're here in the hot seat, I know Senator Creighton touched on some of the successes in HISD, but if you had to guess, ballpark, how long do you think they'll be under TEA supervision?
I can't really wager a guess, but I can tell you at least how the statute works. if a board of managers is placed because an individual campus had 5 years of unacceptable performance, the commissioner is not permitted to devolve back to the start of the electoral process until that campus is a C or higher 2 years in a row. So one, that's a precondition statutorily. Under state law, if a board of managers is placed, there's two-year cycles by which the commissioner uses to evaluate this. So you do an initial 2 years, and then you look and see what happens. At that point in time, the commissioner either says we're done or we extend 2 more years, and then there's an additional 2 more years. And at the end of that second 2-year period, commissioner has to say when it's ending.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Senator Colcross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've certainly appreciated all the questions today. I'm going to follow up on just a couple. I want to go to SPED and SPED identification. You mentioned that when you began, and Commissioner, what year was that?
2016.
2016. In 2016, you said that there were 8.6% of the public school children were identified or placed in SPED. Am I right on that? You made that statement.
That is correct, yeah.
You say now, and I'm going to gather that would be this school year, 14%
Yep.
are identified as SPED. Okay, so just as Chair of Health and Human Services, I know there's a wide array of what moves a child into SPED, but do we know what that increase is? Now, I can certainly say that we have gone from 1 in about 500,000 children with autism to 1 in 36 now. Okay, and this has been coming over a period of years. But what this is a significant increase in SPED.
So we have this and can share the data broken down by primary disability type identified by the student. Under IDEA, there's, I think, 16 different disability types that are identified. And so every one of these students we can identify.
Can you get that to our office again?
We can.
We're looking at health determinants. We're working on making Texas healthier, pushing, looking at the impact of all these different things that lead to a less healthy, chronic illnesses, things like that. So if you could get that to me, it would be very helpful.
I will say that I think the vast majority of that is specific learning disability.
Okay.
And this
dyslexia.
That's right. And this may represent an underlying shift in children, but it is probably more likely to represent our system's ability to see specific learning disabilities has improved and know that we need to give those students specific interventions.
So on page 12 of your handout, it says that there's 130% increase since 2012, 2013 in what we call the special education full and individual initial evaluations.
And that, just to make sure that I'm clear on what that number is, that is first time suspicion of a disability.
Okay.
So that's an annual thing. First. So these are children that we suspect of being eligible to be supported by special education, and therefore we evaluate them.
Okay. So anything that you can get to our office, we'd appreciate.
Yep.
We want to look at long-term disabilities and what we're identifying there. I want to go to this chart really quickly,
Yes,
Commissioner.
ma'am. Yep.
And this is about SHARS and how we pay for SPED. SHARS, for anyone listening, is School Health and Related Services. In over a period of time, if I could identify this, around about 2011, maybe shortly thereafter, the increase in SHARS funding went up exponentially in Texas. There was a time when the federal government said, Texas is an outlier. Like, we weren't even close to anybody else. Like, it was, when I say off the charts, I mean off the charts in funding in SHARS and how we were drawing that down. In conference calls that I've had with y'all and HHSC, I think there were a number of consultants that were engaged in advising our school districts of, if you can do this, you can get SHARS. For example, transportation, hand washing, other things like that the federal government said, no, that is not considered anything that would have to do with the disability. That would be done in the normal course of day. Am I right on that? I'm paraphrasing and making this a little more simple than it is, but in general, the federal government said, you can't charge all of this.
In the last 12 months, that's what's happened. They said you can't charge on this.
Right, like hand washing should happen every day. That is not working on a child's disability. That happens in the normal course of the day, right? So to Senator West's point of, when you find this, I would think that some of those consulting agencies should be held liable for the advice that they gave to our school districts. I'm just saying that, okay? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I think that there were 2 consulting agencies or consultants that heavily advised, if I remember correctly from my conference calls.
That sounds right.
Thank you. Members, I would encourage you to go find out who those 2 are. So we're going to now not have that allowed. And what you say on your chart, I believe, which is the one that I held up, that's about $400 million and it'll be recurring. And then it says about, and I don't understand this part, it'll lead to a $1.7 billion per year deficit approximately.
Shall I explain the chart just for clarity?
Yes, please.
So that chart, and members, I don't know if all of you have that in your packet. I've shared this in prior hearings, and it's on our website, but I don't know that I printed out copies for the committee today. Oh, you do? Okay, good. This was initial analysis done during this Special Education School Funding Commission, which we updated in the last 6 months or so. And you have 2 rows, or 2 columns twice, one for 2017 and one for 2022. And the difference between the 2 columns are the blue column, bluish column, is every revenue source that we identify that is earmarked to support special education students. And so the bulk of that is state formulas in special education. There's also IDEA, and there is SHARS, because we generally think of, and school districts generally experience SHARS as, this is revenue for stuff that I'm doing for my special education students. And it's an expense reimbursement, but even when you no longer get reimbursed for SHARS to do that, you still have to do that in support of special education students. So you've got sort of an all-in revenue picture for special education, and then the goldish bar is from their internal accounting data that they report to us in their audited financial statements, how much they're spending on special education. And so in 2017, that net delta was about $1.2 billion, meaning that school districts were spending, on average, $1.2 billion more to support students with disabilities than they were receiving in dedicated funding for students with disabilities.
Even with SHARS.
Even
and
with
our
SHARS.
Probably
Even with SHARS.
non-allowable
That's right.
charges to the federal government.
Because
Okay,
we were
great.
getting all that extra. It was about $700 million then that we were getting.
All right, thank you.
And so now, when you reduce SHARS by $400 million, they're still going to get SHARS revenue, but it's only going to be, say, $300 million, not $700 million.
Right.
And there's also just a natural delta between the cost of delivering services in special education and other revenue streams. And so the size of that annual funding gap, which was $1.2 billion in 2017, is estimated to be $1.7 billion per year today.
Oddly, the same number that we saw in the presentation by the LBB that I pointed out, but I think that is really the growth.
Yeah, that's a coincidence.
Yeah. I'm just saying that numbers,
That's right.
when they align like that, you can
Yep.
jump to conclusions, but this should not be. The 1.7 billion in increase is more of the identification of when you started in 2016 at 8.6% going now to 14%.
That's right. Also, that 1.7 billion is a 2-year number. These are all 1-year numbers.
Thank you. All right, excellent. 2 other areas I want to cover quickly. When we talked about COVID money, I pointed out to LBB it was 11.2 billion. You actually corrected me, and if I could, just because I'm going to go members to page 27 of the LBB handout, And you're correct. You said it was no 16 billion, it's 16.2 billion. And if I could just for a second say that the state received federal funding appropriated through the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Act, which is called ESSER, in 3 phases. And if you jump forward, you basically said, well, there's the CARES, there's, what do we call the other one? CRISA and ARPA, okay? And so if you really look at 11.2 billion was ARPA, and then if you look at the other funding was $5 billion that came in CRISA, I believe. Am I correct on that?
That's right, yep.
Okay, so, and if you look at that, it's 16.2 billion. The other sentence, and I think this is really important for us to understand as we work with school districts to figure out the funding hole as general, is you have examined school districts that uses of the grant funds through CARES, CRISA, and ARPA grants. The highest percentage of funding was utilized for student services, and that's an example, counseling, nursing, food at 15.2%, followed by staffing model and planning supports at 12.3%, additional teachers at 12.1%, and COVID-related facility support, which would be what y'all would think of, the cleaning, the PPE, the plexiglass, things like that, and teacher pay raises at 11%. I'm kind of curious that y'all put PPE into teacher pay raises, but we'll get to.
We didn't, but
okay, you split that out.
Yeah, the teacher pay raises was 10.5%. PPE and facility support was 11.4%. Different. Those are
Okay,
different buckets.
perfect. Okay, so here's the point that I want to make. TEA estimates that 38.6% of the funds supported recurring costs. Okay, and so if I do 38.6% off of 16.2 billion, that means that 6.25 billion of what the school districts used is recurring. Okay.
Right, over 4 years, but yes.
Right, so it's there, and as you say, right now is the fiscal cliff. 36.7% were just one time. That extrapolates to $5.945 billion, so roughly $5.9 billion at one time. And then you have a statement in there, TEA was unable to determine the status of the remaining 24.7%, which is roughly $4 billion. So just saying, kind of running businesses like Jimmy and I do, I would take half of that as probably recurring.
Yep.
Okay? I'll give them the benefit of a doubt. So in all, we're looking at 8.253 billion. We'll just round it to 8.2 billion that is possibly recurring for school districts.
Right.
Courtesy of the federal government during a really tough time during COVID. And I look at COVID dollars as Chair of Health and Human Services a lot. What went to the hospitals, the PPP that went to businesses. Yep. So really and truly, Commissioner, this is what I have to say, is that when we talk to school districts, and there's a fiscal cliff created in large part because you're saying that enrollment's flat, with $8.2 billion of recurring dollars from the COVID monies.
Yeah.
And so really, if you look at all the money that we're trying to put in, if we give them $8.2 billion, we're actually just filling the hole that was created by the COVID dollars. They would view it as not new money. And I'm just talking business here. I mean, just sheer money business. So I think it's a real sobering moment when we were able to look at these dollars to see what was recurring. And I know that y'all did a really good job. I work with my superintendent, said this is one-time funding. It's the most money public education has ever had in the history. Is that correct?
Yeah, certainly from the feds.
You said that in an interim hearing. Yeah. I'm repeating you. So in the end, and I think there's some positives here because you went around telling them this is never going to happen again. It's historic levels. And you told them that you actually could supplant, which is very rare that the federal government allowed you to supplant state dollars with these dollars. And y'all encouraged that because you said you can really build your fund balances. And they did. I mean, in general fund, it looks like went up from 19.3 billion, 24.8 billion between fiscal years 2019 and 2023, according to these documents. So members, I think what's really important as we work with our school districts is, in general, and I might be off $1 billion, but not far. I might be under by $1 billion. You're looking at $8.2 billion that came from the federal government that never flowed through the FSP, never showed up on a per pupil spending, missing from our school districts.
Yep.
And then finally, my last point is the payroll expenses. After being in this building a long time, I don't always get surprised, but I was surprised by that. I'm a public school product, okay? I'm going to take the $3 billion per year that does not flow through the bill pattern, the GAA. We give it directly to them. I'm not sure how that doesn't show up somewhere. But if there's 5.3 million children in public schools, am I about right on that?
Yeah, 5.5, yeah.
You keep saying 5.5. The chairman used 5.3. I don't know, the whole SB2 debate, I never heard 5.5. So then actually if 100,000 are going to use ESAs, it's less than 1.7% that would leave, but that's all numbers. I'm a numbers person. I just use 5.3 million children, so that's an extra $566 per student that doesn't go in the $15,500 per student that we were looking at.
You're talking about the 3 million? Yeah,
Yeah,
or 3 billion.
3
Yeah,
billion.
that's right. It's a substantive amount.
So it's nearly, it's just under $600 per student. So
Yeah.
if I look at the 15,500 that you had in one of these charts, it's actually $16,100.
We count we count that 3 billion in that 15.5.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear
We
that.
do
because
count
I
that.
was like,
We
nobody
try to
else
give you
has
an
ever talked-
accurate all-in picture.
Okay, so the 15.5 includes that.
That's
It
correct.
really isn't reflected in some of the numbers that we.
You won't see it in the foundation school program, but you will see it in that because we pull that from all districts' audited financial statements, and they do have to account for the fact that the state paid for that payroll taxes for them, even though they never see the cash.
The state directly pays for the payroll taxes.
That's right. Yeah, it's more complicated than that, but yes.
Well, just as an employer in our businesses, that's a substantial amount.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that, Madam Chair. This has been an excellent. Thank you for your patience with all the members. Great conversation today. Lots of work to do.
Thank you. Senator Perry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very quickly, TIA. Everybody's moving towards TIA. We want them in TIA. Teachers benefit in TIA. Students do. That said, some of my principals are talking to me and saying they get on TIA and then they digress in their teaching ability. Do we have clawbacks or things to monitor or evaluate?
Yeah, this was developed. This was an intentional policy discussion in House Bill 3 when TIA was passed. And what happens is a teacher is designated for 5 years. And they do then have to re-up or they don't keep getting the money. Now, that's a 5-year window. It's different than you could regress single year.
What I'm told is those are close to retirement that get on it kind of get short timers a little quicker. So just a conversation just out there as we move towards it. But
Yeah, I think the question is, would you want to change the policy so that it's a 3-year designation or something like that if you're trying to match closer to
I
the same
think,
year
Mr.
performance?
Chairman, that's a policy worthy of look back because not to punish anybody, but definitely don't want people getting on it and sitting. And lastly, I asked earlier LBB about the 1.7, and just through Senator Colcourt's conversation, it confirms what I was trying to get to. This sheet, if you talk to your districts, this is actually what SPED's costing.
Yep.
And it will be an additional cost that we're not funding all of it, with SHARS going now to 1.7. So you really look at item 1 on page 7, that's just general. That's just kind of, here's your allotment, here's things going on, right? And this is currently what SPED is costing. So what we're spending on SPED and where this is at. This is over and above what we're paying on SPED, correct?
That is right. So
Okay.
yeah,
It's a 1.7 billion cost to fund SPED.
yeah.
And I can tell you the data of my districts that I've gotten, the first however many categories on that sheet are SPED related kids, and it goes from 50 grand per kid all the way down to a number, and then you start traditional kids.
That's right.
All right, thanks. I want to make sure I understood it.
All right, Senator Creighton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just for the LBB, I wanted to clarify, there's been a couple of references to SB2 today, but there's several paragraphs in the fiscal note that start with subject to available funding. But even though that's mentioned, subject to available funding, I just wanted to make it abundantly clear that Senate Bill 2 is entirely subject to a future appropriations process and the legislature making a decision to grow the population of students served and to grow the amount of appropriations beyond what is found in the four corners of the document. There is no, is that correct?
That's correct.
And there is no, there's no language that works as an accelerator to grow the population of students served or the funding. Is that correct?
I think that's correct. The fiscal note is not determinant of the funding level for this program.
And so I appreciate the clarification on that because it's important on those fiscal notes, of course, to understand if a program's continued and what that may look like down the road, but assuming growth of the number of students served and assuming appropriations for future legislatures, there should be some sort of a cutoff in that fiscal note that clearly delineates the bill stops here, but this could be the growth if future appropriations were to happen or future growth were to happen based on the will of the legislature in the future. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think that is our ultimate intention, is just to provide that information, but it is not, the fiscal note is not determinant of legislative decisions.
It created some reservations for the teacher retirement system participants and others that thought that was definite, that there were escalations in the legislation, and there's just absolutely not. So there's a lot of work being done based on those fiscal notes and a lot of messaging and a lot of impact, and I just wanted to make that clear, so thank you. Appreciate the LBB on that. Commissioner, just to wrap up, it should be our top priority this session to provide a multi-billion-dollar pay raise for our Texas teachers. Is it your understanding that we can structure 100% of what we dedicate to a teacher pay raise in the budget to end up in the hands of teachers without school administrators diverting any of that pay raise to other spending categories? Is it your understanding that we can structure the budget to make sure they're protected to receive the pay raise we're all working so hard to make sure they do receive? And I think I'm clarifying that for some teachers that are concerned out there that are mentioning.
So I think to the extent that you want to do that, you likely do need statute to accompany the appropriation. And statute then can provide all the clarity you need.
Thank you, Commissioner. It's certainly very important to me. I know to the members that are working hard on this to not just deliver the emergency item, but to make sure that our teachers end up with exactly what we intend for them to end up with through the districts and within this compensation effort that's historic, dating back to 2019 and all the work that the Lieutenant Governor and the legislature put into House Bill 3 and its success. This is a matching effort on that lift or could be greater. So I just wanted to clarify that with you. Thank you, Madam Chair, for recognizing me on those 2 points.
Yes, sir. And Senator West, you have one couple of quick
questions.
very
Madam
quick.
Chair, 'cause I know we have other work.
We have 50 public cards, and we have a whole list of people still to.
I'm sorry, I'm taking too much
Oh,
time.
no, you can, yeah, you
Sure I can
recognize it, just, of course you can.
I know it.
Don't be repetitive, that's all I'm saying.
I'm never repetitive.
Oh, no,
Insistent, but not repetitive. As it relates to the basic allotment.
Yes, sir.
You did a great job as it relates to page 5 in the annual report, talking about the different buckets of monies. School districts and advocates continue to talk about increasing the basic allotment. And in many instances, the increase in the basic allotment is tied to why districts are having deficit funding and closing schools. But I reference this particular chart on page 5, and it would seem as though can all of the different buckets of monies that you have in this particular graph be used for purposes to, number one, reduce the deficit, and to the extent that they need to, stop schools from being closed?
Not all of them, some of them.
Okay, which buckets can be?
If you turn your attention to page 7
7 in the annual report.
in the annual report.
Okay,
I'll estimate that there are 35 bulleted items. I don't know the exact count on the right-hand side, and you see that kind of table there in page 7.
districts.
Regular program / basic allotment, early education, safety, career tech, special ed, bilingual, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you heard Senator Creighton refer a moment ago to a 55% spending requirement in the special education allotment. So 55% of the money that you receive in special education allotment has to clearly be spent on special education purposes. The other 45% is flexible. So as a result, the other 45% could be spent on anything. So most of these allotments work in that fashion, where they have
That allotment is part of the basic formula, right?
It is, yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
allotment.
Another way of thinking about the basic allotment is the first of many allotments.
I understand that, but
yeah.
I mean, when the particular example that you just,
Yep.
isn't that part of the water?
Yes. Well,
A part of it.
so WADA is actually used for Tier 2 calculation. That there is also the special education allotment. Interesting. I don't know if you want to get into this, but like when a student is in special education, the student generates special education allotment.
Right.
That student also increases the size of Tier 2 that the district receives, and there's no strings attached money. That's what WADA really does is it increases the size of Tier 2 funding, completely unrelated to the allotment, to the underlying W in question. It's sort of like you're getting paid for the special education student twice.
Okay. And what I'm trying to determine, without going on and
Sorry.
on about this,
Yeah.
is we keep on hearing that the basic allotment has not been increased over
Since 2019. Yeah.
since 2019. And my colleague talks about, and rightfully so, that there's other dollars going into per student spending. And we hear school districts complaining that they're having to close schools, they're having to do deficit funding because they're not getting funding.
That,
And what
yes.
we're talking about today is that you're getting plenty of funding to the tune of, how much was it, $15,000 per student?
Okay, that's fine.
And so what I'm trying to figure out is what aspects of this funding should be used by school districts in order to deal with the woes that they're talking about.
Yeah, I think the way that I would answer this question is that a deficit budget is a result of two numbers. It's a result of your revenue and your expenditures.
Right.
So you adopt a deficit, you can be giving more revenue, and you adopt a deficit because your expenses are growing faster than your revenue. That is what is happening in these districts. Now, expenses are growing for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is inflation. But their revenue from the state is clearly going up. Now, the complicating factor is the year that we're in is even though the revenue from the state has been going up, their revenue from the federal government went way down. And so up until the year that we're sitting in, district revenue, net revenue had been going up and up and up and up. The year that we're in right now, I won't be able to tell you for a while, but my guess is that the reduction in federal revenue actually is more than the increase in state revenue. So they might actually see a net spending reduction or a net revenue reduction. But even while their revenue has been going up and up and up until this year, expenses have been going up and up and up faster because of historically high rates of inflation that districts are trying to respond to. And so it is not accurate to say that y'all have not been increasing funding in public education. That is simply not an accurate statement. The only thing that is accurate is to say that the basic allotment hadn't been changed in 2019, but there's a lot of other funding flows. What is different is a kind of a different argument, which is if I put my district hat on, yes, the legislature has been giving me more money, but my expenses I've had to increase my expenses faster than the amount of revenue increase that I've been getting from the legislature. And so this is the reason why you're seeing deficit budgets is because districts are spending more money at a faster clip than they're getting more money from y'all.
Okay. All right, that's what I thought. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Nichols?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This LBB question, page 13, formula items related to the transportation allotment. Find it. I'm talking about the like $1 per regular student per mile to maintain 24, 25 levels. How many years has it been since that's been adjusted, or have there been adjustments made?
It was last adjusted in House Bill 3,
Okay.
fiscal year 20.
So, because I'd heard, most people had heard it hadn't changed in many, many years. It was adjusted last session. All right, thank you.
Different House Bill 3.
Yeah.
Sorry. This is the 2019 House Bill 3.
2019.
Was adjusted.
Yeah, when they overhaul public school finance, yeah. Believe it or not, that's all the questions, Commissioner Morath.
Thank you.
I know we probably wore you out. Thank you very much. We always